We're looking at a big story here now. The projection from NBC News is the Republicans are going to win 250 seats in the House of Representatives, which is 435 seats overall. This is 4 seats greater than their largest majority in history, which they had back following World War II when they broke into the Fair Deal in 1946. This is an extraordinary development here. I expect everybody here to notice. I want to go into Steve now. Steve Schmidt, this is going to be the headline in the big papers tomorrorow, sweeping both houses of Congress. And this 250 thing, we haven't paid much attention to it tonight. This is 32 points over a majority vote. You don't need, so Boehner, however he's going to use it, will have some padding here, some padding. I don't know how many wild people there are. He has some very nasty words he uses for them, but they're out there. Can he work around them now, or is he still a prisoner of them, as you said?
Look, I think it remains to be seen. I think one of the interesting aspects of this, and this was Washington's admonition as he left office, is the warning of the danger of faction in the country. And we have something in the House of Representatives called the Hastert Rule, which means that no vote is put forward unless it's supported by a majority of the majority. We're not a parliamentary system in this country. The parties didn't used to be as homogenous as they are. But on issues like immigration reform, for example, and I think it's in the long-term best interest of the Republican Party, will Boehner allow for there to be coalitions of a majority of Republicans and Democrats able to pass legislation out of the House that's popular with the American people, to send it to the Senate and to the president's desk? He has 250 seats, but is he going to be controlled and ruled over and dictated to by a small minority of his conference, or is he going to assert his prerogatives of Speaker of the House? And I think that that is one of the dramas that's going to unfold over the next couple of
Let me make a case to you as a Republican on immigration reform. As long as your party, and I know you don't believe in it, you just said you don't, as long as your party's intransigent and opposes any kind of path to citizenship, you will never get an immigration bill that's enforced that has any teeth. You'll always have people coming in this country to work in hotels, wherever else, because they're cheap labor. In fact, the most recent arrivals, the cheapest and maybe the best labor. So there's always going to be a market for it. You're never going to change that basic market situation until you have a bill that's enforceable. And you'll never get that unless you give the Democrats what they need, which is a compassionate treatment of the people who have been here for a number of years. Do the Republicans know that they'll never be able to enforce? We will always have people racing across the border for jobs. It'll never stop until you have a new bill. Do they know that?
I live in a Western state. It's self-evident if you live in a Western state, a border state, near the border. The reality is, I think that there are many, many Republicans who understand this. You have the 12 members of the Senate that voted for immigration reform. You have many members of the House that support it. And you also overwhelmingly have a majority of actual Republican voters in the country who think that this issue should be dealt with in a common sense and humane way. You know, this issue has been held hostage by a small minority in the House of Representatives, to the great detriment of the long-term political interests of the Republican Party.
What do they want us to do with people here illegally?
I think at the end of the day, they have an unrealistic and almost delusional expectation that somehow these people will go home, that they'll self-deport or we'll deport them. But it's fantastical. It's not based in reality. And look, at the end of the day, when you look at immigration reform, we have zero net immigration really coming over the border. Most of the illegal immigration in the country is from visa overstays now. And if you want to look at immigration reform from the perspective of stopping the flow of economic migration across the border, the most significant thing in the long history of this issue between our two countries happened in the last 18 months, which is the privatization of the Mexican oil industry. Mexico is about to be a very rich, very wealthy country with a lot of economic growth. And as Mexico's economic growth rates go up, we'll see those immigration levels come down.
Okay.
We've got a call right now in a governor's race that we've been watching very closely. In the Maine governor's race, we've got a call. NBC News now projecting that Republican incumbent Governor Paul LePage has been reelected in a three-way race there against Democrat Mike Michaud and the independent Elliott Cutler, who sort of half dropped out of the race last week, but not entirely. And his name was still on the ballot, and he was polling as of our most recent numbers tonight at 8%. The other outstanding governor's races at this point, by my count, still Connecticut and Colorado outstanding. Steve Kornacki, what do we know about those?
Yeah, well, let's take a look at Colorado now. This is John Hickenlooper, the incumbent Democrat, trying to win a second term. This is a nail-biter at this hour right now. You see Hickenlooper trailing Bob Beaupre, the Republican, by 7,000 votes. A couple things to tell you about this, but first, let's take a look at the map. What Democrats are hopeful for right now, as you start right here, this is Denver, biggest city in the state, big Democratic area. You can see the number that Hickenlooper's getting here tonight. At 80% more of an estimate, but there is outstanding vote here, so there's an opportunity for Hickenlooper to make up some ground here. Also, we can look in the suburbs of Denver to the east of Denver. This is Adams County. Take a look at the outstanding vote here. Only about 2/3 reporting right now. Slight Hickenlooper lead. This is sort of a classic swing county. Hickenlooper slightly ahead. He could make up a little ground here. At the same time, though, Bob Beaupre has some of his strong areas out. We can look right here. This tells you a lot about how the night is gone. This is El Paso County. It's mostly all in right now. El Paso County is the home of Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs, focus on the family, the Air Force Academy, military, cultural conservatism. This is the number you're seeing here for Beaupre tonight. The reason he is leading right now, this is fantastic for Republicans, what they were able to do in El Paso County tonight. And really, when you're talking about this area, Colorado Springs area, this is the story of where things politically started to go wrong for the Democrats under Hickenlooper in Colorado, because it was the Democratic state Senate president from Colorado Springs who, with Hickenlooper, pushed through gun control legislation. And then last year, that state Senate president in his El Paso County district was recalled from office. In hindsight, that was the warning shot, so to speak. And then tonight, you see again the Republican base here really energized for this. But here's the most important thing to tell you about Colorado. If we look back at the overall result right now, we don't have the, well, that's not how you do it. Let's see if this does it. Here it is. We don't have the decimal points here, but what this works out to right now, it's changed again. It's down to 5,000 votes. This is about 48.1. This is about 47.8. The law in Colorado, if you are within 0.5%, and this is right now, if you're within 0.5% when these are all counted, there's an automatic recount.
Fascinating. You know, on that Colorado Springs region, as we were talking about there was another House race there that was very interesting tonight. The big high-profile House race in Colorado was, of course, Mike Coffman versus Andrew Romanoff. Republican Mike Coffman was able to win in that race tonight. But the other one that I thought was interesting was actually a very conservative district in and around Colorado Springs. Doug Lamborn, the Republican incumbent representing that district, not a military veteran. It's the third most military district in the nation, who's running against a retired Air Force general named Irv Halter. And right at the beginning of the campaign, a tracker drops a video that shows Doug Lamborn saying that he's been secretly working to get U.S. military generals to quit the U.S. military in order to make a statement against President Obama. And he's been working on this behind the scenes, trying to get generals to quit in wartime. Irv Halter, who was the Democrat who ran against Doug Lamborn, was not able to pull it out. It's a really conservative district, and Doug Lamborn was reelected. But I have a feeling that Irv Halter is going to run for something else sometime soon.
Rob, did you want to get
one thing that, you know, when you see that 250 in the House come up behind you guys, you're starting to get really big numbers that aren't going to get turned in a cycle or two cycles. And we haven't gone through these numbers, but my guess is that Republicans picked up state legislatures, which are the pathway ultimately to cementing these gains through redistricting in a cycle or two. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, again, to get back to 218 for the Democrats it's not a one-trick deal anymore. That's what they banked on. Yeah, that's what they were banking on when they put together this campaign. Build out enough of a moat around the House that even a Hillary victory will not give her control of the House, and therefore the ability to legislate.
Well, one of the things that, you know, as we started out the evening listening to Steve Israel, the chairman of the DCCC, talk about the fact that your average midterm loss, or in the 6th year of a presidency, is 29 seats. And that may be the case, but that occurred in an era where there were more than 20 competitive races. And, you know, Rahm Emanuel, I think, had the best line I've ever heard anybody talk about with regard to the problems we have with redistricting, which is we used to live in a country where the voters pick the politicians. We now live in a country where the politicians pick the voters. And, you know, with 20 competitive House seats per cycle, it's very difficult to flip the House from 250 seats.
And just the sheer number of swing seats out of 435 is just a small number, which makes it almost impossible to get stuff done.
MSNBC's coverage of this historic election night, I got to tell you, is going to continue in just a few minutes when Ari Melber is going to take over through the night as results still continue to come in. I'm Rachel Maddow along with Chris Matthews.
Hi.
And Chris Hayes and Casey Hunt. And Ari was about to change seats. As we said, several races are still outstanding, so do not go anywhere. We'll be right back live.
Welcome back to our continuing coverage of Election Night Decision 2014. I am Ari Melber here at MSNBC headquarters in New York. We have live reports this hour from key states, including new details on why Republicans took back the Senate tonight. Also, we have reports on why one of President Obama's signature issues, raising the minimum wage, just won in red states like Arkansas and Nebraska. Democrats saying it shows voters are mad at Washington but happy with some liberal policies. Yet Republicans say on the big issues, this was their night.
Tonight, Kentuckians said we can do better as a nation. Tonight, they said we can have real change in Washington, real change. And that's just what I intend to deliver.
NBC News can project that the Republican Party has maintained control of the House of Representatives.
The Republican Party, as is currently constituted in this year, pretty much sent the Tea Party back to the locker room.
We can and we will send him legislation. Under Mitch McConnell's leadership, we will send the president bill after bill until he wearies of it.
The projected winner in the Iowa Senate race is Joni Ernst. This is an Iowa gain for the Republican Party, but this also means that Republicans gain control of the United States Senate.
Thanks to all of you, we are heading to Washington. And we are going to make them squeal.
Here's what we know now, 11 p.m. on the West Coast, 2 a.m. out here at East. President Obama will face the last 2 years of his presidency with the opposing party in power in both chambers of Congress. And even before some of the results from the most hotly contested races were in, the Republicans had won the 6 seats that they needed to take control of the United States Senate. At this hour, Republicans now have an 8-seat advantage in at least one key Senate race. Louisiana is headed for a runoff in December, and the Republicans will keep control of the House of Representatives. Not only that, they have built up at least 250 seats to the Democrats' 185 House seats. As Chris Matthews was just saying, this is a historic advantage, a firewall there in the House. Now, here's how some of the key races broke down in those heated contests to control the Senate. At this hour, still too early to call the race in Alaska, where polls across the state just closed about an hour ago. Democratic incumbent Mark Begich in a tough race there against Republican Dan Sullivan. Over in Colorado, the state President Obama, of course, won twice. The Republican Congressman Cory Gardner defeating Democratic incumbent Senator Mark Udall. In Kentucky, of course, Republican Mitch McConnell poised now to be the next Senate Majority Leader. He basically easily dispatched Kentucky Secretary of State, Democrat Allison Lundergan Grimes. In another closely watched race in North Carolina, Republican State House Speaker Tom Tillis coming what some would say from behind and defeating another incumbent Democratic Senator, Kay Hagan. We're going to have to wait another month, though, to find out about that outcome in Louisiana, because neither the incumbent, Democrat Mary Landrieu, or her GOP challenger, Bill Cassidy, got those necessary 50%, that threshold to avoid a runoff. And that's largely thanks to a third-party candidate, a Republican, getting some support there. As you can see up on the board, Landrieu and Cassidy will now face off December 6th, and we'll be watching that. Then in Arkansas, another Democratic incumbent dropped tonight. Mark Pryor went down, losing to Republican Congressman Tom Cotton. And that big race in Iowa, where Democrats thought they would do better. Republican State Senator Joni Ernst defeated Democratic Congressman Bruce Braley to become the first woman here, the first woman to represent Iowa in the United States Senate. Down in Georgia, David Perdue, a Republican businessman, defeating Democrat Michelle Nunn, a would-be political dynasty, and winning enough to avoid a runoff there, another Republican pickup. In Michigan, Democrat Gary Peters, though, defeated Republican Terry Lynn Lamb to win the seat being vacated by longtime Michigan Senator Carl Levin. And up in New Hampshire, a little more bright spot there for the Democrats as Jeanne Shaheen narrowly defeated Scott Brown, making his second run, of course, in a different state, the former Republican senator from Massachusetts. Now, we have a tremendous panel tonight. Howard Fineman starting us off, Charlie Cook and Maria Teresa Kumar. I'm going to hear from you in a moment on what this all means and this historic House majority. But first, I want to go to Iowa now, where, as we say, NBC News projecting State Senator Joni Ernst defeating Democratic Congressman Bruce Braley, and that picks up the seat there from retiring longtime legendary Democrat Senator Tom Harkin. Now, in her acceptance speech earlier tonight, she returned to a phrase that garnered her so much national attention and also struck a hopeful tone in overcoming some of our nation's problems.
But thanks to all of you, we are heading to Washington. And we are going to make them squeal. But you know what? ISIS isn't just going to go away. The almost $18 trillion of national debt is not just going to go away. Our economic struggles aren't just going to go away. And our problems aren't just going to go away on their own. But we can overcome them.
NBC's Luke Russer joins us from Iowa. Luke, we have this unfortunate phrase, a kingmaker in our politics, but we don't elect kings, we elect presidents. We're looking at a woman there who really built a groundswell and now is a potential president maker in that key state of Iowa.
I don't think it's far-fetched to say, Ari, that Joni Ernst is without a doubt the star of this Republican Senate class that was elected tonight, not only because of her impressive personal story, which basically won her this election, which is being a veteran, being a woman, and being 44 years old, and also being able to have these rather extreme Tea Party views and then moderate them closer to the election. She sort of becomes what the GOP establishment has envisioned for their Senate elect for this cycle. But you talked about the kingmaker. So if you think about Joni Ernst moving forward in the state of Iowa, which is so important for Republican presidential politics, here you have somebody that was endorsed by Sarah Palin and Mitt Romney. She's well-liked by the establishment because they think that she'll do business with them. She's well-liked by the Tea Party because she had an ad talking about castrating pigs, rides her motorcycle, God, guns, and guts, the whole bit, if you will. So here you have this person whose endorsement, not only in this state, but also through, I suspect, a national fundraising apparatus that will grow around her if she, in fact, plays her cards right. And she will have, I think, a lot of power. I talked to Democrats before this race, Ari, and they said, you know, it would be great to knock her off because she's someone who could be around for a while and be a thorn in our side. Now, maybe she goes to Washington and lines up with the Ted Cruz part of the party. When I asked her if she'd support McConnell for leader, she was coy and wouldn't say if she would. But from the inclinations I get and from seeing the D.C. Republican operatives who have been around her and have taken over her campaign in the final months, I think she'll keep her head down and more likely than not try and be this Mitt Romney, Sarah Palin Republican, which is what they ultimately would like to see in Iowa come 2016.
Have it all rolled into one. Stay with me, Luke. I want to go to you, Maria, on the significance here. This is a woman, first, as we said, elected ever to the Senate from Iowa, that the Republicans think they can use to appeal to women without having to give an inch on policy.
Well, she is from the military. She speaks incredibly well, and she's actually telegenic. And yes, she talks about pigs and everything, but she actually does it well. I think that the Republicans actually have a big shot with her, and they've realized that they actually had to run a candidate that had substance, unlike Sarah Palin. She definitely has substance.
Charlie, for folks who think of Iowa as a Democratic state, who think of Tom Harkin and his famous steak fry and all the good retail blue politics out there, how big a shockwave is this?
Well, I wouldn't say it's that big of a shock. I mean, the thing about Iowa, you've got Tom Harkin, one of those liberal members of the Senate. You've got Chuck Grassley, one of the most conservative people in the Senate. And what that tells you is somebody that's a hell of a politician can win in Iowa. But the default is sort of more Democratic than not. All Bruce Braley had to do is not be a jerk, and he'd have won this race. I mean, let's face it. But you had enough there that he basically blew it. And no, you have to give her credit for having, picked up on the opportunity and captured people's imagination. But this was Braley's race to lose, and he did.
Howard Feynman, is that the 11th commandment of American politics? Don't be a jerk.
Sit down and shut up would be what Chris Christie would say. I actually think that I've probably spent more time in Iowa than almost any other state that I don't actually live in because of covering all those campaigns. I thought presidential campaigns. I think Iowa culturally is sort of trending politically a little more conservative, actually, and I think Joni Ernst ended up being right where enough of those voters wanted somebody to be, and I agree that she's a major figure now for sure.
I think to Howard's point, small-town rural America is not clicking with where the Democratic Party, it's clicking a lot of places, not small-town.
And that still is primarily what Iowa, outside of Des Moines, that's all of what Iowa is. And I think the evangelical movement's very strong there, as we know. The Republican caucuses there have been turned into a raucous, important part of their election process. So I was not totally surprised that this happened. And don't forget, they've had a Republican governor now for a while, Terry Branstad.
Well, so Luke, speak to that point, and the idea that, look, this is still the state that Rick Santorum won, right? This is right in the Republican Party, at least for those base voters. Obama expanded some of the caucus turnout on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side, there's that real conservative core base, and then this disaffection with the actual candidate the Democrats were running.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think it's fair to say that Braley was a flawed candidate. All that being said, had he run a better race, I'm not so sure he would have won considering tonight's environment, and also looking at the returns he got in some of the very important counties in Iowa, Polk County specifically. But in terms of Ernst, and you just sort of look forward with her, she checks all the boxes that you presumably need in a Republican presidential field. And she really is the only person who I see that does this. I'm not saying she's going to run for president, although I think she could be on a short VP list someday, especially if Hillary Clinton runs. But I do think that when we look back on tonight and what the storylines were that emerge, is that every time you sort of have these waves, you get these sort of people who come out. And in 2010, it was, Rand Paul and Chris Christie and Scott Walker, and they sort of dominated the Republican conversation for the next few years. I think Joni Ernst, if she wants to be, can be one of those high-profile rock star GOP people. I would also go as far as say is in the Senate, when it comes to issues of national security, Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire has really tried to sort of be that female voice in the GOP on those issues. Well, look out. Kelly Ayotte, because now you have a veteran who actually led troops in Iraq, who's well-versed in these things, who I suspect is going to get a call from John McCain and say, hey, come be on my committee and hang out with me and Lindsey Graham, and let's bash the president's ISIS policy a little bit.
Right. And
so I just think that she's,
Well, I was going to say, the big shift there, though, for her is she gave a nice barn-burning speech tonight saying ISIS is a problem that's not going away, the deficit's a problem that's not going away. Those are great applause lines. She's going to go to Washington now and have to explain what does it mean? What is her ISIS policy? Is it not going away so you want ground troops, or do you just want the same program the president's basically put in place? Luke Russert, on a long election night here, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Take care, buddy. Have a good night.
We've got a breaking item here on something a lot of people care about. South Dakota minimum wage direct referendum just passed. That is another red state joining Arkansas that has now backed a minimum wage. The voters speaking directly on policy. You see it up there on the screen here. We're projecting there with 87% in, 54% saying increase the minimum wage to $8.50 by January 2015. The voters of South Dakota not waiting on Congress, not waiting on the federal government. We will have a lot more with our panel and more from the field. We'll be right back.
When the gap got to 100,000, we figured it was time to do the right thing. And so that's what we need to do. And we need to come together. We really do. Losing is not fun. But what is most important is that we come together as a state.
Losing is not fun. You can ask a number of candidates tonight. There was Charlie Crist, a Republican turned Democrat, conceding to Governor Rick Scott in the race, of course, for the governor of Florida. We are also keeping an eye on some of the results in some interesting House races. And let's look again at the North Carolina 2nd, where former American Idol runner-up, someone you may have heard of, Clay Aiken, has once again found himself in 2nd place, with Elmer's handily beating the Democratic challenger there. And joining me now, I think we have Rafi Williams, Deputy Press Secretary for the RNC. Are you feeling good tonight?
Feeling very good. We're all celebrating, having a good time. This is a great night for us, a momentous night, and we're really proud of the work we've done on the ground, the work our candidates did, and really proud of the party tonight.
Yeah, and when you look at these races, what stands out to you as something extra, something big, a bonus that isn't just in what we might call Romney state?
Well, I think you look at Colorado and Iowa as two purple states where we proved we could win. We put together a great ground game using our digital and data efforts to lay the map out, and we executed as well as we could have, and that showed big wins for us, and that's a great way and a great pathway into 2016.
What do you say to voters who look at this and say, wow, you guys got 250 here in the House, as we're showing up on the screen now, 52 and possibly growing here in the Senate with a pickup of 7. But that is clearly a reward for a type of obstruction and a do-nothing Congress that rivals the lack of productivity going back to the Truman era. And people are worried. Some are worried that now the Tea Party will be emboldened, it will be driving the train, and there will be pressure on your party to continue to obstruct this president and not do anything.
Well, I think that, the whole premise there is a little off. Harry Reid has over 300 bills that are sitting on his desk that he's refused to act on. He's the one who did the filibuster, the nuclear option, the filibuster, and he still refuses to push through Obama nominees because he was afraid of putting tough votes up for Democratic senators. But they still were voting with Obama over 90% of the time, and it backfired on him because he really stalled out the Congress and really got people upset at incumbents. So they paid the price today.
Rafi, stay with me. I'm bringing in my panel here. Let me go to you, Charlie Cook, on that.
I think the thing that jumped out that Rafi said that I think is absolutely right is that Harry Reid exposed some of his senators by protecting them, shielding them from casting tough votes. It would have given Mary Landrieu, who still has a runoff to go, but Mark Pryor, give these folks an opportunity to create some distance. I mean, they were having numbers like 97% voting with Obama. They didn't have chances to vote on a lot of big things, tough things that would have actually given them chances to create some little distance. So.
But and building on Rafi's point there, Maria, I mean, Tom Tillis was telling Chuck Todd just this week, hey, it's all about action. It's all about productivity. That's certainly a different message than what some of the incumbent Republicans were running on.
Absolutely. And also something that Rafi said, though, is the fact that the Republican Party, the GOP operation, has a better ground game now when it comes to digital and the media. And I think that was actually very evident. When you go into Colorado and saw the stuff that they were doing on the digital front, they got incredibly sophisticated. So while President Obama's base and the Democratic machine had that in 2008 and 2012, the Republicans are catching up, and they're catching up quickly.
Rafi, you mentioned digital. What are you talking about? You're talking about your data and your voter file there, online fundraising. What do you think the metrics are that correlate with the kind of pickups you've had here?
Well, all of the above. So in 2012, I think we all can agree Republicans trailed Democrats on all those fronts. But what we've done is completely revamped our data, so understanding voter scores, understanding consumer data, using that to figure out low propensity voters that we can persuade to go to the polls, making sure that then translates into our voter contact list, making sure that goes into door knocking. And then we've also done it on the social media, online fundraising side as well. So we're now much stronger on that, using that to raise a lot of low dollar amounts from voters. And so it's across the board, we've improved all over the place, and it's really a great thing to see, and this is a big reward for us for all of our hard work.
Certainly a reward, and Howard Feynman, you have to give political credit where it is due. There are results here that certainly benefit the Republican Party and in states that they weren't necessarily supposed to win. Yeah. But if we want to talk about data, one could also argue the Republican Party at the state level has been very good at using data to get around democracy and really shore up some of these districts.
Well, both in terms of voting, the ability to vote and in terms of gerrymandering, absolutely. But what impressed me tonight not only was the Republican victory in the Senate, but the way they won some governorships in places that I think bode well for them in 2016. I mean, they're breaking the wall a little bit, the so-called, you know, the big blue wall of the 18 states plus the District of Columbia that Democrats have won in presidential races for the last 6 elections, and that give them 242 electoral votes to start out with. You had a Republican victory in Illinois. You had Scott Walker hanging on in Wisconsin. You had Republicans making some inroads in New England and in Maryland, of all places, where the Democratic candidate for governor in Maryland just got wiped out in what is usually a very Democratic state. John Warner on the Senate side running a very close race. Mark Warner in Virginia. Mark Warner in Virginia. And don't forget, Virginia has been considered kind of like the Democratic and Obama beachhead in the South.
Sure.
And for John Warner, Mark Warner to have almost lost that race, I think is significant. So if you're a Republican looking to 2016, yes, you've got a whole bunch of Republican senators exposed for re-election that year, but looking at the ground game in the states, and the governors matter in the states in presidential elections, I think the Republicans have to be encouraged right now, and they deserve a lot of credit.
We're going to be sifting through these numbers for the next couple of weeks, but I think one of the things that we'll see is that a lot of Democratic voters were despondent and they just chose to stay home. And it was in pockets, for example, the Mid-Atlantic, where Mark Warner's race was a lot closer, where Democrats lost a governor's race in Maryland that nobody expected them to lose. There's in upstate New York, a bunch of Democrats running, you know, either losing or running very, very closely. I think a lot of Democrats just simply stayed home.
Well, and I would also like to look at the analysis of what did the elimination of the Voting Rights Act have on its effect on this election. It's the very first election where we
The elimination?
Of the Voting Rights Act. Well, it was gutted and basically completely gutted. And what you're seeing, for example...
Yeah, you're referring to Section 5 being taken out, which deals with some of the
Section
pre-clearance.
4, basically, right.
Right, well, and Section 5 being the enforcement mechanism, but you still have lawsuits continuing in Texas, for example, under other parts of the law, Section 2. They won that case. So
exactly.
Split decision.
So, for example, what you see right now in North Carolina, in the beginning of October, basically, the Supreme Court said that they couldn't do same-day voter registration. In 2012, you had over 100,000 people use that to their advantage, historically, disproportionately African-American and Latinos. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when you actually unpack that and how that affected
briefly. I mean, Charlie, you spend more time on these races than just about anyone. What do you think that impact is?
Well, I mean, I think if the Voting Rights Act were repealed, probably Democrats would capture the House back. That the Voting Rights Act actually works against Democrats in terms of packing in a lot of these heavily Democratic districts, right? And allows basically redistricting to do what it is, where it's basically
you're talking about majority-minority districts. You're talking about voter suppression,
exactly,
which are linked issues, which we could do a whole hour on, and we're here late tonight, so we actually have more on that. I want to get to Rafi because he's saying goodnight to us. Rafi, final question. You heard earlier tonight Republicans and Democrats on our air talking about if there is executive action on immigration, where does that go? Some saying, well, that is grounds for impeachment. Is that, in your view, a legitimate response for Republicans to consider impeachment there now that they have this supermajority?
I mean, I think that if you're looking at these potentially unconstitutional acts coming from Obama here after the election, after he just got his whole agenda rebuffed by the voters across the country, I think it's a dangerous precedent to set. I think it's a dangerous action to take, and I think that the Congress will take the proper response to it.
So you're saying proper response could include impeachment. You're not ruling that out here.
I mean, I'm not a legislator, so I can't say that impeachment is the way to go.
Well, you're speaking for the party tonight.
Well, I think that what you have to look at are other ways to do this and other ways to combat the president's executive action. I don't think that we're going to impeach him, no, but I do think that there are other ways to rebuff it.
All right, look, I appreciate you staying up late with us and giving us a glimpse of the RNC perspective here. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, and we are going to be back with a whole lot more coverage tonight, including those minimum wage ballots. 2-to-1 we saw minimum wage support in Arkansas, a red state. We've also got the latest on Alaska and live reports out of Alaska with some interviews there, so stay with us. MSNBC's election coverage continues here on this midterms evening. Welcome back. It is 2:30 on the East Coast, 11:30 out west. It was a good night for Kentucky's Mitch McConnell. He didn't just win re-election. He took a big step towards his longtime goal of running the Senate. You can see him there with his wife, Elaine Chao. He's the architect, of course, of the GOP policy of blocking the Democrats at every turn. And yet tonight he said, look, this victory wasn't just about him.
So tomorrow, the papers will say, I won this race. But the truth is, tonight we begin another one that's far more important than mine. And that's the race to turn this country around.
MSNBC's Perry Bacon was at the Senator's victory celebration there in Kentucky. He joins us by phone, and also we are still joined by Maria Teresa Kumar and Joan Walsh, MSNBC contributor and Salon editor-at-large, joins the panel as well. Nice to see you both.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Perry, if you can hear me, let me start with a short question and a short answer. Who got the biggest applause speaking there at that rally with McConnell tonight?
Mitch McConnell actually did, only because this was his crowd of his aides and his supporters. But Rand was a very, very close second. Rand Paul did as well.
Yeah, and you were telling us earlier tonight from some of your reporting, Rand Paul, who was as loyal politicos will know, has a long-running feud and rivalry with Mitch McConnell. But here, when it came time to work together here for their Republican majority, you said he's actually become something like a second family member on the trail.
Like on the trail, I remember yesterday, when McConnell's speeches were over, he would stand and wave to the crowd. On one side would be Elaine, his wife. On the other side would be Rand Paul. When Paul first came to the scene, McConnell in 2010 endorsed the other candidate and suggested Paul would be a bad person for the Republican Party. But McConnell is smart about politics, saw the rise of Paul, and saw that the Tea Party in Kentucky was getting stronger. And in this campaign, Paul has been McConnell's biggest advocate. McConnell has really sucked up to him, and that really paid dividends tonight. McConnell had this huge win. We thought it'd be a close campaign. He won by 16 points.
Yeah, I mean, this turned from something that was at one time potentially a toss-up to, as you say, a thumping. Stay with me, Perry. Joan Walsh, I want to bring you in here. Look, we know this happens on both sides in politics. Our good friend Charlie Crist at one point was calling for Clinton's impeachment. Right. You looked up last week, you saw them campaigning together. Right. And yet, as we look at this large Republican majority, the fact that the Rand Pauls of the world are ascendant seems to be important for where we're headed.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in that relationship, it's almost like Rand Paul is the senior senator. He's the mentor to Mitch McConnell and helping him navigate this brave new world of far-right people in his party. But this is a case of be careful what you wish for Mitch McConnell, because Ted Cruz just got joined by a whole lot of wacko birds. He's got a lot of friends now. And Joni Ernst, Cory Gardner, tip of the spear, Tom Cotton. It'll really be, and Tom Tillis, who we didn't necessarily think was going there. Ted Cruz has a lot of company for his brand of politics, and it'll be interesting to see whether Rand Paul can kind of be a mediator between that faction and McConnell.
So, Perry, what were you hearing from Republicans on the ground there? Because we know McConnell's favorables were never that high, and yet, as you reported, he's done great here. Is there a feeling that now he has to be an even stronger Tea Party conservative, whatever that would mean?
No, my sense is that he wants to figure out, and you heard this a little bit in his victory tonight, is he wants to figure out how to kind of strike that balance between having lots of taking on Obama. Like Rand Paul's speech tonight was very much about we need to take on Obama. And McConnell talked about that. At the same time, he talked about we should cut some deals. We should make sure Washington is working. McConnell is definitely thinking about 2016 and how do the Republicans win the presidency. You heard Kevin McCarthy, the new House Majority Leader, give a speech last week in which he said, we've got to show we can govern. We can't keep having government shutdowns. And McConnell's in that same place. McConnell's a party person. He wants the Republicans to win the presidency, and he knows they can't do that if they are constantly involved in shutdowns. Remember, McConnell's been behind a lot of, he's broken a lot of Washington, but he's also behind a lot of the deals that have gotten done in Washington these last 2 years as well.
Yeah, when you think about his life ambition, in many ways, his entire career starts over if he wins this majority leader race, which is still not a technicality. They got to convene and all that. But his life starts over, and who knows? If you want to be an optimist, Perry, yes, maybe he feels a desire to do something. Perry Bacon on a long night in Kentucky, thanks for your time. I want to go to another important race where we have some more breaking news. The polls in Alaska closed now for just over an hour. It's in the race for Senate there. Incumbent Democrat Mark Begich facing off against that Republican challenger Dan Sullivan. Now, the race could take some time to call, but this is a big one that remains open for us tonight. Alexandra Gutierrez is the Capitol correspondent for Alaska Public Media, so we're going right to the source. And what we have with about 50-some% in is Dan Sullivan here, obviously a little bit in a lead on the screen, but it can be misleading at 50-44 because NBC News says, hey, this race is still way too early to call. What can you tell us?
Well, it's too early to call, but the margin has only gotten bigger as the night has gone on. It was about 4 points. Now it's 5 points. And with a lead of 12,000 votes, there was, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is a huge number in Alaska. There was some concern that we might not have an answer by tomorrow morning, and we would have to wait until next Tuesday when the Division of Elections would start counting extra absentee, early votes, and question ballots. But there's a good shot that we should know who our next junior senator will be, and right now it doesn't look very good for Begich.
And if that is the case, or if Begich, in your view, struggled at least, because we're not making any kind of call yet, what did you see as the big issues in the close of this race?
Well, you know, Begich has run one of the best campaigns of all of the incumbent Senate Democrats. He got a lot of plaudits for the ground game he ran. His ads up until September got a lot of positive attention. And then he had one major misstep with this ad he ran that talked about Dan Sullivan's record as Attorney General and accused him of giving light sentences to sex offenders, and then focused on this one case where it was a double homicide and a toddler was assaulted, and that was deemed as beyond the pale. It was rated as pants on fire lie. That was kind of the turning point where people started to wonder, is he really going to survive this? In the past couple of months since that ad ran, Lisa Murkowski has come out stronger for Dan Sullivan, saying that she wants a partner in him in the Senate. Begich had been running ads saying, hey, we vote together 80% of the time, but when your opponent has her actually endorsing you in campaign ads, it doesn't really work as well. And
Alexandra, just briefly, do you think the candidates might be speaking tonight? Is that going to happen if it's that close to a call there?
It looks like there will be some sort of announcement at one of the candidates' victory parties. Or they call them that before they even happen. And I was at these events earlier tonight, and the mood was pretty different at each of them. There was a lot more confidence at the Sullivan party. The Begich party was packed, and there was a lot of fun. But the second that you start asking people how they feel, it immediately went doom and gloom. I mean, there was one state senator that I spoke with who said, I feel like he's got zero shot at this point.
Well, Alexandra, they gotta call them victory parties, because the power of positive thinking is very important for both sides in politics. Alexandra Gutierrez, thanks for joining us on the phone. We're going to keep an eye there on whatever happens in Alaska, and a seat that has not been called yet. I want to bring in Victoria DeFrancesco Soto there in Texas. Can you hear me? How are you?
Howdy from Texas, Ari.
What did you see there today?
Well, today we saw a lot of disillusionment with the Democratic Party. I'm not going to lie. We knew it was going to be an uphill battle for Wendy Davis and the rest of the Democratic slate, but I don't think we were prepared for the magnitude of it. But I do think that we can't lose sight of the fact that we've owned up to it. We've said, you know what? Texas is a challenge, and we need to start building the foundation going forward. Texas isn't going to turn blue in 5 years or 10 years. It's going to take a little bit more time. And now we know we have that reality check that we need to roll up our sleeves and work hard with that.
What do you think about the gender dynamics here? Just looking broadly at the national exits, you have, of course, women going Democratic, 52-47, but it being so much more lopsided among male voters, basically.
Well, we know that women still have particular concerns that they don't feel that the Republican Party is really addressing. It was a little different here in Texas. We did see more support among Greg Abbott with women. But, you know, what we're going to see is in 2016 is the Republican Party taking note of this and saying, OK, how can we diffuse the war on women? We can't necessarily win it, but how can we diffuse it? So I think we're going to see a lot more of what Cory Gardner did in Colorado. They're going to take a page from his playbook.
Yeah, well, Maria, the problem there, though, for folks who are looking at that and who are discouraged is, especially when you look at this 250-person Republican majority in the House, they think this approach is working.
Right. Well, and I think actually the person right now that's kind of shaking their head is Boehner. He's basically saying, crap, now I have to, oh, shoot, can I say that?
You can say it. It's late.
Right, it's late. No, so basically saying, crap, now I have more of, I basically have to herd more cats than before. And I think something that you mentioned earlier, too, Joan, is absolutely right. Mitch McConnell now has to deal with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was asked this election night if he was going to vote for Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He couldn't say yes. So I think Mitch McConnell is going to have to become the elder statesman, try to become the Republican Party so that he can go back to 2016 and demonstrate that Congress has done something.
But, Joan, doesn't it get worse before it gets better? Because Ted Cruz has the backup plan of the House bazooka of all these guys who follow him in the House, even when McConnell does make a deal.
Yep. Right. He's got power in the House. Now he's got more power in the Senate. So I think it's going to be very interesting. And the question is, a lot of people seem to be a lot more optimistic that Mitch McConnell really wants to lead and compromise than I am personally. I remember when he told Politico that his plan was to attach riders to every spending bill, to defund financial services reform, to defund the EPA, to defund Obamacare, and force the president to veto them, and then that we could wind up.
Well, his mandate was to make sure that Obama failed, right? That was, he said.
Well, but I mean, he said more recently, if he became majority leader, he said just a couple months ago, if I take that over, this is my plan. And it was a plan for gridlock because, yes, Obama would veto those things. And then does the government shut down again? There's a very good chance.
You know, Joan, I'm old enough to remember when Mitch McConnell was an obstructionist as well.
Yes.
So we'll have to find out if that changes at all. We are going to continue. The panel stays. I want to tell you what's up next. Despite some of the early predictions, Georgia voters did avoid that runoff in the election in the race for Senate. We have Joy Reid. She's there in the Peach State. We're going to talk to her live. It's all about these Republican wins and also the backlash. Welcome back to our live election coverage, 2:47 a.m. on the East Coast. We're starting with a look at one of the House races we've been keeping an eye on, Republican John Klein holding on to his seat in Minnesota's 2nd District. Klein was, of course, the target of comedian Bill Maher's Flip a District campaign, which was launched on his HBO show. Now, that effort fell far short of its goal, with Klein running off with it. Now, it was also a big night for the Republicans at the state leadership level. Take a look at this. They have so far won 23 governorships for a total of at least 31. So far, the Democrats have picked up 8 governorships for a total of about 15. Pretty lopsided. Now, here's some of the key gubernatorial races and how they're playing out. One of the races going down to the wire right now. The contest in Colorado, where Democratic incumbent John Hickenlooper and Republican Bob Perez are locked in a tight race. Steve Kornacki was breaking that down to a couple points. Another nail-biter underway in Connecticut. Democratic incumbent Dan Malloy trying to fend off a challenge from Republican Tom Foley. Then down to Florida. You got Rick Scott narrowly defeating the former Florida governor, now a Democrat, Charlie Crist. And this was the most expensive race in Florida history and one of the nastiest. Over in Wisconsin, embattled Republican Governor Scott Walker, not so embattled tonight, and now a possible 26th presidential contender with his stock rising. He won re-election, defeating Mary Burke, the Democrat. In Kansas, Republican incumbent Sam Brownback was re-elected, that despite the concern from some Republican voters that his conservative proposals were not only too extreme, but fiscally irresponsible. That race there, you see 50-46, still much tighter than it was supposed to be. Now up in Maine, Republican Paul LePage, re-elected governor, beating Democratic challenger Mike McCall. Now, in the South, Democrats hope to rally base voters and put more states in play. That plan didn't always work out, though, and it was an especially bad night for some of those legacy names, those potential Democratic dynasties like Carter and Nunn. Michelle Nunn, former daughter of the former senator, I should say, Sam Nunn, lost to David Perdue. Jason Carter, grandson of former President Jimmy Carter, defeated in an effort to become Georgia's next Democratic governor. And joining me now to break it down, MSNBC host Joy Reid, who has been all over the place, most recently at Nunn headquarters. How were they taking all of this tonight?
Well, I got to tell you, the atmosphere definitely started to change as it got later in the night, because there was a sense among a lot of Nunn supporters, including the mayor of Atlanta, so pretty late in the night, that this might go to a runoff. And as you started to see that Perdue lead go from, mid-60s down to higher 50s, there was a sense that he was trending in the right direction. But then it got kind of stuck in around the mid-50s, and I think people started to get a little pessimistic. But by the time Michelle Nunn came out and gave her speech, the crowd was really warm. There wasn't like a despondent sense, because it's Georgia. I think people understand the state they're in. And the whole night, Ari had really hinged on this 30-30 proposition, meaning that what the Michelle Nunn campaign, or Jason Carter campaign too, had to do is they had to make the electorate 30% African-American, as they say, with 31% African-American population, but that also Michelle Nunn needed to win 30% of the white vote. Mm-hmm. She did the former and wasn't able to do the latter, and I think that's what started to concern the campaign sort of midway through the night, because it did appear, and it, in fact the exit polls bear out, they were able to make the electorate more minority-rich. Right. It was slightly over 30% non-white, 29% African-American.
And briefly, Joy,
Michelle Nunn never got to 30% of the
briefly,
white vote.
Joy, let me ask you, though, we've seen these different races, we've seen some tendencies nationally, but did your reporting on the ground reflect that this was about the fundamentals of Georgia, or about the candidates and Nunn not being able to make it close?
You know what? I think it really was just about the fundamentals of the South. You have a region in the country where white voters are trending toward the Republican Party in about the same, margins in some cases as African Americans go for the Democratic Party, or that Latinos go for the Democratic Party. That's just the reality in the South.
All right, Joy Reid on the ground after a long, long night of reporting. Thanks for your time. Up next, we're going to talk about something that we stopped hearing about near the end of the race, Obamacare. We heard about it a lot in the beginning of this year, but as almost every midterm campaign went into the home stretch, we saw both sides come away from it, and something pretty interesting in these exit poll results. Democrats potentially helped more than Republicans by that issue that we might have forgotten about. That is up next. Welcome back. Obamacare was an issue that seemed to disappear as this campaign went on. Let's go to MSNBC's Craig Melvin for some of the new insights from these exits.
So President Obama's signature legislative achievement. We call it, most folks call it Obamacare. Officially, it's called the Affordable Care Act, widely known as Obamacare. The law has been the subject of nearly $500 million of political advertising since 2010, virtually all of it negative. So the NBC News exit poll shed some light on how Obamacare factored into the election. Take a look at this, guys. Some interesting numbers here. Usually the case, no surprise, the economy, top issue. Usually always the top issue facing the country, is according to voters. Number two, 25%. 1 in 4 voters said that the most important issue this time around was health care. Among those voters, just about 6 in 10, almost 60% of those folks voted for a Democrat in the lower chamber. They voted for a Democrat in the House. What do voters think about the health care law itself? A very important question this election in particular. Here's the answer. Almost 50%, nearly 50%, 48% of folks we talked to in our exit poll say that it went too far. But just as many were generally positive about the law, saying either that it was about right, or 1 in 4 folks saying that it did not actually go far enough. Of course, views on this, as you might imagine, very partisan. Nearly 8 in 10 Republicans say the health care law went too far, while more than 4 in 10 of Democrats, as you can see here, say that it did not go far enough. So again, just a look at voters nationwide and how Obamacare factored into their decision in the ballot box there. Ari.
You know, Craig, this is fascinating. It won't be the headline. The headline is Republicans running away with this thing. And yet, if you would have said this to most political elites in either party 2 years ago, they would have been shocked. You put the number as well. 59% of folks who like health care as their top issue went Democrat. The other side of that is only 39% went Republican. So you're talking about a 20-point edge there. I want to bring in Joan Walsh here. What you're basically seeing is we know people are polarized on this issue, but the ones who said it was their top issue overwhelmingly going Democratic, even without hearing a strong closing argument in support of this law.
Right, and it did not seem to drive Republicans to the polls. We know they don't like it, but it wasn't their top issue, and we never would have predicted that. And I do think, we were talking about this before, there is a sense of what if the party had made a better pitch around Obamacare, what if they'd been stronger in embracing it.
Let me bring in Christina Bellantoni, who's with us from Roll Call's Washington headquarters, and Hogan Gidley, Republican strategist and former Santorum aide, also joining us from Washington. Good evening to you both. Christina, your thoughts on this piece here, because, again, not the headline, but as a subhead, when you think about all the ink spilled over Obamacare and the website and what's going to happen, and here it's breaking for Democrats.
So what's really interesting here is that Republicans were able to change the narrative of this. When you talk to just everyday voters that aren't that engaged on elections like we are, they say, hey, you know, Barack Obama passed this major piece of legislation without any Republican support. That was a strategic decision from Republicans in both the House and the Senate very early on that is still playing out and showing consequences today. It obviously was a major part of the 2010 Tea Party wave, and then you see it play out tonight. I mean, this is the first time that these senators have had to face the voters since the Affordable Care Act was passed, and the Republicans were able to make it about this, even if it's not a top issue, that undercurrent that it's Obama's fault and that these Democrats were just doing his bidding and they had not a single GOP vote, even though so much of what's in the Affordable Care Act was actually crafted, you know, by Republicans or had Republican language in it. This narrative shift was something that they were able to do really early on that has benefited them.
Hogan, were you surprised that more Republicans weren't mobilized here by this as a top issue?
No, I think that occurred early on. I think Republicans have been angry about Obamacare for a long time. This election wasn't necessarily about Obamacare. It was just more about Obama. And that was just another one of the little cogs in the wheel, if you will, that turned voters out in droves on the Republican side. And you know, with all the things going on, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's the IRS, the NSA, whatever it is, you put Obamacare into that mix too, and it just angered a lot of voters, Republicans, some Democrats, and I think over time it began to erode a lot of the president's popularity. It wasn't a main issue in this election, and we all know this, guys. It's about the economy, and Democrats didn't run on it. But look, I do want to mention one thing. You did point this out. I thought it was really good, and that's the sense that you know, why didn't the Democrats run on Obamacare either? But let me say, the Democrat consultants that have been handing us our hat for the last 3 election cycles, okay, they didn't just all of a sudden turn stupid. They just didn't have anything to work with. Obama is clearly unpopular. If Obamacare, if their polling had shown Obamacare was going to win them some of these elections, I'm sure they would have put Obamacare forward as a positive. I'm sure if their polling showed Obama himself was popular, they would have sent Obama to these states. It wasn't, they didn't, and they lost the election because of it.
I hear you there, Maria, though. The counterpoint to that is that polling only takes you so far. Sometimes you have to lead. And give it to the Tea Party this. We have Hogan here, who's as friendly with the Tea Party as anyone else on this panel. Give the Tea Party...
That's easy.
But give the Tea Party some due on tactics. They at least step out front of where the polling is, for sure, to set an agenda. Absolutely. And if healthcare was the signature achievement, and healthcare was important enough, and by the way, if you care about policy, over 10 million Americans getting it, why not lead instead of sitting around looking at polls saying, well, I guess we won't talk about anything?
Well, not lead it. They actually, folks forget that the number one reason people would declare bankruptcy before Obamacare was because of healthcare costs. This actually dramatically reduced and changed people's poverty line, their ability to actually pay their bills. And when you start talking about the economy, the fact that the Democrats didn't own the economy, you actually have the lowest unemployment rate that you've seen. You have the Dow Jones at a whopping 17,000 points. No one's talking about that. No, the Democrats, what they failed to do is actually embrace Obama and the stuff that they've done under his watch. And instead, they miscalculated and thought that the Republican Party was taking.
Let me bring Christina back in from Washington here. You know, the other piece of that is there is other data here in this electorate, which clearly went to Republicans and isn't a high turnout electorate, that still embraces what you might call center-left positions. You look at what should we do about immigration. 57% of this electorate nationally saying offer folks a chance to apply for legal status. Only 39% saying, well, let's deport them, okay? You see marijuana and gay marriage also going the other direction. And so what you seem to have is a Republican Party that ran a really strong race, not only in the Romney states but elsewhere, but is actually bumping up against even a midterm electorate that is not as right-wing as these candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. And think about, too, I don't know if this was reflected in the exits or not. We're not quite there yet, but the nation remains war-weary, and there's still this actual coalition of Republicans and very liberal Democrats who don't want to see us doing any sort of engagement abroad, or who are a little bit worried about civil liberties and protections when it comes to, you know, national security issues. So those are areas, too, where the Republican Party just looks different. It's a younger Republican Party. So all of those are things that we're watching.
Yeah, it's a great night for Republicans. I think we all can admit that. But that doesn't necessarily mean the American people have a wholesale buy-in to everything we're pushing. What this means is they're upset with Obama, and they've given us a chance here to actually govern something and try and enact some Republican policies and try and make the country better as they see it. Now, whether we capitalize on that could have significant 2016 ramifications and obviously elections moving forward. But it's not a wholesale belief in what we're about at this point. The Republican brand still isn't great, but we took some big leaps and big bounds today. Whether we can capitalize on that still, only time will tell.
Right, and whether you're listening to a country that obviously is giving the Republican Party here a huge chance, but is very angry with the way Washington is run. And Washington, let's be clear, has been run on an obstruction platform by some Republicans for a lot of the time. We're going to keep the panel here, so you guys stay with me. Republicans, in terms of what we're talking about next, have gained control of the House and Senate for the first time in 8 years. We're going to look at what the relationship is between President Obama and that GOP-led Congress, including a new announcement about a meeting the president's going to hold this week with leaders from both parties. Stay with us. Welcome back to MSNBC's live continuing coverage of the midterm election results just after midnight on the West Coast, 3:08 a.m. out east. I am Ari Melber, and we are looking at what must be called a big night for the Republican Party, and we're breaking it down, making sense of how the GOP won so big. This hour, we're also going to be taking a deeper look at the other big winner of the night, the minimum wage, which has succeeded even in red states where Democrats haven't fared as well. But we're going to begin with what is no doubt about it, Republican victory. This is, for the first time in 8 years, Republicans now controlling both houses of Congress for the rest of Obama's presidency. Here are the numbers. So far, Republicans picking up 7 seats. That's one more than they even needed to take control of the upper chamber. Republicans maintaining control of the House with now, get this, 250 seats so far. The Democrats, 185. You have to go back many decades for that kind of majority. And throughout the morning, we're going to be checking in with our team of correspondents out covering all the key races. We've got live reports, we've got tape reports, we've got everything you need to know, we've got exit poll data. It's going to be fun. And one of the swing states where Democrats lost was a Senate seat in Colorado. Now, that's a state you may remember. President Obama won twice. Incumbent Senator, though, Mark Udall, losing to the state's newest senator-elect, Cory Gardner.
Together, we can build a stronger economy. Together, we can achieve energy independence. Together, we can improve education. Together, and we can protect our incredible environment together. Because tonight, the people of Colorado sent a message that is what is happening in Washington isn't working, and it has to stop. That our country expects and deserves better than what it is getting. That leaders shouldn't stop at the status quo and think they deserve a pat on the back.
MSNBC's Benji Sarlin is there in Colorado for us.
Colorado really stood out in this election as perhaps the race that Republicans wanted to win most badly tonight. That's because it's one of the few races that seems to have some serious implications going forward for whether they can win in 2016. Now, most of the Senate races this year were fought in conservative-leaning states like Arkansas or Louisiana. But Colorado is different. It's a state, it's very diverse. It's got a large Latino population. President Obama won it handily in 2008 and 2012. And Cory Gardner is a pretty conservative candidate, yet he managed to pull off this victory. Republicans are likely going to try to replicate his approach throughout as they look towards the next round of elections in 2016. On the governor's side, it's still too close to call. Hickenlooper's not going to give a speech tonight here to supporters. Bob Beaupre, as a Republican challenger, also is not going to. We were told by a Hickenlooper spokeswoman tonight that he's, quote, totally going to win, but not tonight. So we're still in for a long count there that's likely to go into the morning.
Thanks for that. Totally going to win, but just a little bit later. For a look at the big picture, we have Democratic strategist Basil Smikle here, and Maria Teresa Kumar, and we have Christina Bellantoni from Roll Call in Washington, an elections expert. Basil, let me start with you. We care about not only the results where the Republicans are doing well, but the issues. Colorado's a place where you had the war on women tested. You had this discussion of personhood. You have a discussion of immigration there and the Latino vote. And then, of course, the jobs conversation that's been going on. How, with that kind of bucket of issues, in a state that, as we said, Obamacare, did Republicans do so well?
Well, it's part of the themes that we've been talking about all night, which is that, and something very vexing to so many of us, that Democrats fail to sort of own up to the things that we've actually done well. If you look at Obamacare, which you talked about in the last segment, if you look at where Obamacare has actually done well, where it's actually helped people, it's helped mostly African Americans, Latinos, folks between the ages of 18 and 34 in a lot of states like Colorado, California, southern Texas, Kentucky, Arkansas. And so these are themes that the president or the party itself could go in and tout as victories, and we just did not do that at all.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, unfortunately, the president basically did a gamble. He rolled the dice and said, I'm not going to do an executive order on immigration until after the midterms. What did he do? He left Udall right now, Senator Udall, standing without anything to hold, and basically go back to the Latino voter and says, look, I actually stand on your side. And I think that that's actually one of the biggest criticisms coming out of this election, is that the president not only rolled the dice on immigration, but also that not enough Democrats actually embraced the policies that made him successful.
That's right.
Christina, I wonder if you could speak. Yeah, I'm going to get you in here. Can you speak to the half-life of the Democratic complaint about obstruction? Because when you start out early and you say, hey, they're in the way, and look at the Tea Party, that may work for a while and may work with the base. But it seems that over time, when you are the president, if your party's biggest argument is they won't let me do stuff, that wasn't working today.
Well, I don't know. I have 2 points to make. I would like to talk about Senator Udall, but just to respond to that, I think that voters really sent a message. They are irritated and tired of gridlock, and all of the Republican responses tonight were about working together, finding solutions. We're going to move forward for America. What I would point out about Senator
let me jump in there,
Udall
and let me jump in, but I'll give you a chance to respond. Of course they're going to say that. I mean, they're not going to say, well, we're going to continue the obstruction. John Boehner put out a statement, to your point, and he said, hey, this is a time for solutions, not celebration. But the record and the type of people coming into office, you're a congressional expert, doesn't seem like people who are going to meet in the middle on governing.
I think that the Republicans in the Senate and the Republicans in the House are very different, and this is going to be a challenge to come together. It's not going to be about the Republicans in Congress and the White House. It's going to be about the Republican struggle. But Senator Udall, I want to point out, did not run. He had a very big distinction with the White House, and that is on torture issues and civil liberties, and he did not run on that at all. He made a choice to run on this Democratic platform, saying that Cory Gardner was going to take away, women's right to choose, that sort of thing, and he didn't draw that distinction with the president on a really big issue that he actually has a major true distinction on and a record to stand on.
And tell us what you're talking about, the release of the CIA torture report investigation and those issues, and how do you run on that in this jobs environment?
Well, I mean, you certainly say, here's a major issue I disagree with the president on, and you didn't hear him saying that. And in fact, you know, he just was getting tied to Obama and making this a national election for months and months.
Basil, you're shaking your head.
No, I think that's a really important point, which is that, and I go back to the Grimes example of this, you can disagree without ignoring and repudiating. You can just come out and say, look, I disagree with the leader of my party on this issue, but on many other things, I am standing with him. And I think that is something that Democrats failed to do across the board.
Yeah, well, and I also think that it also is a testament to voters. Voters want to know where you stand. Right. You mentioned Grimes. Yeah. Well, so did Orman. Orman took you by half because he didn't want to say what party he would vote for. And I think that that's one of the main reasons he didn't win tonight.
Yeah, and I wonder if all of you are putting your finger on the macro mood, which is folks never take what politicians say that seriously. Why would we? But in an environment where the trust is so low,
that's right.
Those kind of dances and those kind of steps fool some of the people some of the time, if I can quote Bob Marley because it's getting late.
Thank you.
But that's not going to work as well when people are this fed up, as we've said, and as a numbers show with both parties. Up next, we want to talk immigration reform. Of course, one of President Obama's campaign promises stalled in Congress for months. Will his post-midterm agenda include that executive action? And as I asked the Republican spokesperson tonight, is impeachment the punishment for that? That is straight ahead. Welcome back to our live coverage. In addition to gubernatorial and Senate races tonight, we're also looking at some specific and telling House races, including an interesting one up in New York. New York's 11th district, Staten Island, has voted to return Michael Grimm to Congress, even though he is facing a 20-count indictment for tax fraud and other charges. Innocent until proven guilty, though. No trial yet there. President Obama is expected to take action, though, on immigration reform in the coming weeks, or at least many are hoping so. But did the issue have an impact on the outcome of these midterms? MSNBC's Craig Melvin is tracking all the exit polls and the new data. He's joining us with some insight we didn't even have ready earlier tonight. What do you got?
Just getting it in. A few minutes ago, we talked about health care reform and how we thought that was going to be an issue that galvanized. Let's turn now to a key demographic, the Latino vote, which, of course, as we know, has tilted heavily Democratic over the past decade. Exit polls tonight, 63%. Here it is. 63% of Latino voters voted Democrat tonight. As for the views on immigration, about three-quarters of that 63%, about three-quarters of these folks, and 56% of other voters favor giving illegal immigrants who are here working in this country a chance to gain legal status, something we have been talking about a great deal over the past few years. In terms of Latino voters and their views on the White House, this is something we've talked a lot about tonight. Here it is. Views on the White House. A majority of Latino voters, as you can see here, still approve of the president. But you look at the numbers in 2010. 32% said they disapproved of President Obama in 2010. That number has crept up to 39%. 39% in 2014. And you can also see, obviously, his approval numbers have dipped as well. Dropped 10 points in the span of 4 years. So something that we'll be talking about a lot over the next few days, over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
Or remember, but again, exit polling still continuing to come in. We're going to spend some time in the next segment talking about the shifting social mood in this country.
Yeah, and I got two numbers I want to add to that because these exits are really fascinating, and this is the template both parties are looking at going forward. Let me bring in our panel, NBC contributor and attorney Raul Reyes, MSNBC.com executive editor and all things MSNBC, Richard Wolf, and returning here, Maria Teresa Kumar, president and CEO of Voto Latino. I want to get to all of you guys. Two more numbers to add to Craig's list, though. That entire conversation, though, about Latinos is only 8% of the midterm electorate. 12% African-American, overwhelmingly white, only 8% Latino. So that's the portion we're talking about. And the other big number that I found pretty interesting on illegal immigration, Raul, is when you ask people what their top issue is, only 14% of this wider midterm electorate says illegal immigration. Right. And yet, when you get to those answers, they break 73% Republican. It definitely mobilized some of them somewhere.
Right, and on the flip side, it also shows really what seems like a missed opportunity for the Democrats in Colorado, because a lot of the exit polling of Latinos showed about this time around, yes, illegal immigration and the immigration reform was a top issue for them, for Latino voters, but what motivated them to turn out at the polls was more of a sense of just representing the community and making the votes count. The numbers were lower in terms of going out and supporting Democrats, and much lower than that than supporting Republicans. And the fact is, Cory Gardner was able to wage a pretty effective campaign by saying, I'm for immigration reform. And yet to him, his definition of immigration reform, he was very vague on it.
Yeah.
His definition of immigration reform is border security and maybe a guest worker program. And Mark Udall never really pushed him on it, never really called him out.
No, you're hitting something important, Richard Wolff. These word games, we all remember it depends on what the meaning of the word is. Well, for some people, everything is amnesty, right? And for other people, nothing is maybe good enough. And yet, another ray of light for folks who think there's a middle here, a common sense path. 57%, I mentioned this number earlier, 57% of this midterm overwhelmingly white electorate says, hey, let's figure out a path to legal status. Does that mean it's political malpractice, the folks who couldn't find a way into that?
Political malpractice is not to have a position. And Democrats went into this election saying, well, we're for reform, but we're not going to do anything about it just now, which is no position at all. That allows the other side to say, well, what I stand for is reform because I don't know what you stand for. The same is true of saying, you know, the Republican position on taxes is really about jobs. Well, how can you make that case? It's really a position on taxes. You can pretend it's about jobs only if the other party does not come up with a jobs platform. So in the absence of a policy, and that's really where the president and the Democrats ended up. The absence of action meant that there was a huge vacuum there, and yeah, you could appeal to people who wanted border security, but you could also pretend that you were for reform because there was nothing to compare yourself to as a Republican.
Well, and I think the president rolled the dice and said, we're not going to do executive action until after the midterms. And he was expecting to give cover to Landrieu, to Hagan. And instead what he did is that he let Udall out to dry. And that, I think, is one of the biggest consequences in the narrative moving forward, is that the Democrats have to act. The president has an opportunity to do executive action. Yes, the Republicans are now saying that they're going to impeach him. But let them try, because at the end of the day, they need the Latino vote to get to the White House in 2016.
So, Richard Wolff, on the straight politics here, one of the things you don't hear about as much, and I suspect we will hear more of in the coming days, is you have a President Barack Obama who still retains very high favorability, not always complete support, but very high favorability and respect among the core-based constituencies of this party. But you talk to the political class in Washington, not that they should always be listened to, but the consultants and a lot of the electeds, and they've been saying for a long time, the White House political operation doesn't know how to support us. Are we going to hear more from that in the coming days?
Yeah, sure we are. But remember, this was a president and a campaign in 2008 that said, we're not really like the Democrats. We're running against the Democrats. We're running against the Republicans. He's a whole new movement. He's never been that close to his own party, and his party has returned that lack of affection in heaps. They were going
when you say party, you mean the professional class?
I mean the Washington party, the elected officials in Washington who feel even more bitter now that half of their friends have just got kicked out of their jobs. So they're going to repay that, but I don't know that any of them had a position. I mean, defining themselves for or against where the president was when the president really wasn't taking that much of an active role is the whole ball game here for Democrats. They didn't take a position on immigration. I have no idea what their economic policy was in this election.
Right. Well, and they didn't run towards his economic policy, which actually we are experiencing some of the best economic period in the country. Not that said, though, not everybody feels it that way. But had they actually embraced the job numbers, Colorado is a perfect example. That Latinos enjoy the lowest unemployment in the country. They didn't talk about that.
No, and that goes to the political piece. I guarantee you, if Karl Rove had these job numbers, it would have been propaganda central. But, you know, the data doesn't always speak for itself. Obama's handling of the economy from October 2010 to now, locked at 43%, hasn't budged. Meanwhile, you've had all these consecutive months of job growth. Stay with us. I'm going to go next to voters in 5 states deciding whether to raise the minimum wage. I've been mentioning this because it's important, because it affects people's lives. It's another big part of the story tonight. And up next, a look at the results and what it should tell Democrats to do if they want to find a pivot point as they move forward.
Whether you voted for me
against me or didn't vote at all, I'm going to work every single day to keep Texas the best state in the United States of America. I am so proud to have by my side my wife of 33 years, Cecilia. Who has now made Texas history as the first Hispanic First Lady in the history of the great state of Texas.
Championing education, fighting for sexual assault survivors, pushing to raise the minimum wage, demanding greater awareness of the hazardous chemicals hidden in our communities, and working to protect women's access to health care. We won day by day because this wasn't just a campaign to win the governor's seat. This was a fight to make sure that that seat belongs to you.
Texas Governor-elect Greg Abbott and the Democrat he beat, Wendy Davis, there speaking after tonight's results. Welcome back to our continuing live coverage of the 2014 midterm elections. I'm Ari Melber, 3:30 on the East Coast, 12:30 out west. And in addition to all these results in the Senate and gubernatorial races, we also, as promised, taking a look at some interesting House races. Florida's 2nd District, Gwen Graham, daughter of former Florida Senator and Governor Bob Graham, has won her race against the incumbent Republican, a Tea Party candidate, Steve Sutherland. That was one of the most expensive House races in the country. Now, one thing is clear. Americans do want a raise. In 4 out of 5 states where some kind of proposal to raise the minimum wage was on the ballot, the measure has passed. In Illinois, voters supporting raising the minimum wage from $8.25 an hour to $10 by 2015. Arkansas, a very Republican state, voted 2-1 to raise its minimum wage up to $8.50. Nebraska voting to raise the minimum wage to $9 by 2016. South Dakota, another red state, voters saying, hey, let's get it up to $8.50 by 2015. And then there's Alaska. Votes are still being tallied, but there's a proposal there to raise the wage, and it appears headed for approval, according to NBC projections at this hour. And exit polls showing most Americans who voted Tuesday, more than 75%, are worried about our nation's economy. Now, what role did that play in an overwhelming Republican victory in an electorate, even in a midterm year, that in some places wants to be paid more per hour, regardless of all the debates back and forth? Let's go to Joan Walsh, MSNBC political analyst, editor-at-large at Salon.com. Basil Smikle back with us, and Josh Barrow joins us from the New York Times and also an MSNBC correspondent. And out in Washington, Republican strategist Hogan Gidley. I'd give you more than a minimum wage for all the time you've put in on MSNBC for us today. I want to welcome you all. Let me go right to you, Josh Barrow, new to the panel. This is not to sugarcoat the fact that Republicans obviously have an endorsement of a lot of their platform, which is against the minimum wage. And yet in Arkansas and other red states, these voters, this midterm electorate, made the distinction.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you can have an issue where voters are with one party, but it might not be the issue they care most about and the issue that they vote in candidate races on. So we're clearly seeing a higher minimum wage is popular all across the country, popular in blue states. And there are 10 states that raised their minimum wage through the legislature in the last year, 9 of them run by Democrats. And then you have 4 states that look set to raise their minimum wages by ballot initiative. Legislatures run by Republicans in those states would not pass minimum wage increases, so people went around the legislatures, collected signatures, and got them on the ballot. But in those states, voters are still re-electing Republicans to the legislature. Actually looks like electing more Republicans to the legislature in Arkansas, for example. So, yes, Democrats have a vindication of their position on the minimum wage, but I think there was this idea that Democrats nationally should really run on the minimum wage as a key economic issue to go to voters in candidate races. I don't think that idea has been vindicated.
Right. What you're talking about is the policy here is big for people whose lives are going to be affected, but the political transference question, right? Does this motivate? Basil was talking about this earlier in the hour. What were you running on? Let's listen to Senator Jeanne Shaheen, though, tonight talking about this. Let's play that.
I will fight for a minimum wage. That ensures that no one working 40 hours a week is stuck living in poverty.
Goes to the roots of the Democratic Party. It goes to RFK, and she's a federal official there. She is talking about a federal minimum wage.
Right, and what's interesting to me, and going to your point, this is a tough call for Democrats because although they are responding to the needs of their base, and you see even Republicans like John Kasich say that he's expanding and has expanded Medicaid because he may disagree with Obama on Obamacare, but understands what his constituents need. The problem for Democrats is that they're also dealing with some tough fiscal budgets. And you see even here in New York and in Connecticut where governors have had to actually get concessions from unions, the very folks who are pushing minimum wage. And you see in Connecticut that Malloy got concessions from the union, but also raised taxes. So the Democrats are really in a tough position here because they want to be supportive of their base, but they're also, many of them actually, looking at other offices, higher office, and want to appear as though they can be in the middle.
Yeah, but Joan, they also want to go on offense. Scott Walker being reelected, he was setting the table on these issues for a long time.
Right, and I mean the minimum wage, actually, if you're a fiscal conservative, you should like a hike in the minimum wage because it will get people off welfare programs, off food stamps. So the failure of the Democrats to message around this issue is kind of unconscionable. On the other hand, I also think that there's a sense, yes, people support the minimum wage, but to get to what Josh was saying, does it drive their vote for politicians? Do they hold those politicians accountable for not passing it? And do they also want to see why are wages stagnant or even eroding? Did Democrats talk enough about that? And I would say no, even as a Democrat.
Right,
so.
and again, that goes to the trust climate. These exit poll numbers, Hogan Gidley in Washington, these exit poll numbers show folks don't trust government, sure. They don't trust Washington. They also don't trust a lot of big businesses to decide what's best for the American people. Now, does this go farther and show a progressive direction? Let me read to you a new piece out in the Washington Post here tonight from Katrina Vanden Heuvel, editor-in-chief of The Nation, to get your response. She says, look, no issue has been a bigger political winner this year than raising the minimum wage. Republican Senate candidates look as though they're cruising to victory, she wrote at the time, in Nebraska and South Dakota. Voters in both states will approve a higher minimum wage. The success of these initiatives in red states in an election cycle that favors Republicans who block these bills in Congress is important. It shows people want to see progressive reforms, not the center-right policies. Is she right?
That's the first time I've seen that quote, obviously, but just at first blush, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, Josh made some great points. I mean, it may be an issue that people do care about, and I think there are some Republicans who want to see some movement on this issue. I've talked to several in the last several days, the last several months. They want to see it on a state level, which is what we actually saw, but they don't want to see it from a federal level, and I think that's going to have to be a conversation that people like Mitch McConnell bring to the fore if we're going to have some credibility with some of these demographics. But Josh is right. I don't know that it actually moves voters to change their vote. I think, and it's not an issue that's wrapped up in the economy as a whole. I think it's kind of a niche issue right now, one that is going to be more important for Republicans to focus on, because as I said before, there are so many issues Republicans need to tackle almost immediately. I don't think this is one of them, but I definitely think this is something we need to have a conversation about. And throwing out crazy numbers without compassionate hearts is going to really hurt us if we just turn a blind eye to it.
He mentions you, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I think, most households do not have a minimum wage earner in them, don't have an earner who will get a wage increase because of a minimum wage. So I think a lot of middle-class people look at the idea of a minimum wage increase and they say, yeah, that's a good idea. I think they probably see it more as a fairness issue than an economic growth issue.
Right.
But I think those voters, while they favor a minimum wage, they're not necessarily angry when a minimum wage doesn't get passed because they don't see it as affecting them directly. So I think the lesson for Democrats here, if you want higher minimum wages, put more minimum wage referenda on ballots. It's likely that they will pass. But I don't think the lesson for Democrats is that they ought to talk a lot more about the minimum wage, ought to try to make it a bigger issue in campaigns going forward, because they really did talk about it a lot in this campaign, and I don't think it really connected with voters as an economic message.
Yeah, and Basil, I want to get you on the flip side when we come back. I mean, you've worked for the Clintons, and Hillary was just talking the other day about who creates jobs and what kind of jobs. But that is a big question, and Rand Paul was out here this week saying he's all about tax cuts for jobs. As you look at 2016, this messaging relates. So stay with us. The panel stays. Up next, a look at how social issues like gay marriage, women's rights, and legalizing pot are also shifting the political landscape. Welcome back to our live coverage here. You've heard the headlines by now if you're watching. It may not have been a good night for Democrats, but they did have a few bright spots, and that includes New Hampshire. Incumbent Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen was able to hold on to her seat, defeating a guy you might remember, former Massachusetts Senator Scott Brown. After a tough race, Shaheen made sure to pledge to work with her colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and Brown thanked his supporters for giving him a chance.
I promise you, I will work with anyone in the Senate, Democrat, Republican, Independent, to get things done to help New Hampshire's working families and our small businesses.
I'm so very, very thankful for the people who are willing to come out and help give me a shot and give us an opportunity to try to make a better state. That's the spirit of New Hampshire. And it's lucky. And I feel lucky. I feel like a lucky man to live in this great state and call it home.
Do you feel lucky? He feels lucky. It's getting late. We're all lucky, all of us here tonight. Now, at the state level, there has been a lot of action this year on the hot-button issues. We've talked about abortion, same-sex marriage. But as we get these new data numbers, the new exits here, were those social issues a factor in the midterm elections? Our numbers guru, MSNBC's Craig Melvin on the late-night shift with the calculator, with the boards. What do you got?
No I just got an on-air promotion. You called me a guru. 4 a.m.
Well, the guru title is free. Anything Zen-related is free.
So we asked voters their opinions on a number of social issues. First social issue, something that again, we've been talking about a great deal here, same-sex marriage, now legal, of course, in 32 states and the District of Columbia. Take a look at these numbers here. Today, about half of voters, 49% of voters, say that their state should legalize same-sex marriage. That number actually up 8 percentage points, 8 percentage points over just 4 years ago. Take a look now at the jump specifically among young voters, amongst younger voters here, voters under the age of 30. Under the age of 30. I want to actually, it's late so I can play. There we go. So take a look at that. Under the age of 30, 2010, 52%. 2014, that number's jumped 13 percentage points. It's climbed to 64%. Turning now to the legalization of marijuana, which, of course, was on the ballot in a number of states tonight. Colorado passed it. Washington State passed it back in 2012 on the ballot in Oregon tonight. Also on the ballot in a different form in Florida and Washington, D.C. as well. Voters nationwide on legalizing marijuana, 49% say that marijuana should remain or should be legal, I should say. 47% say illegal. And that's actually breaking down, as you might imagine, to a certain extent. 61% legal. 61% of Democrats favor the legalization of marijuana. A similar number of Republicans oppose such a move. Lastly here, views have not shifted a great deal when it comes to abortion in this country. 53% of voters, according to our exit polling here, say that it should be legal in all or most cases. 43% say that it should be entirely illegal. We'll have much more of our exit polling ahead in our live continuing coverage of the 2014 midterm elections. Stay with us. It's still very early.
We have a result in another big House race we've been watching tonight. Utah's 4th, Mia Love, making history. She is the first black Republican woman elected to Congress. She won a squeaker against Democrat Doug Owens. That's a name you're going to be hearing a lot more about. Now, Democrats and Republicans made some great strides to reach out to women voters this election cycle. Aside from candidates, many initiatives dealing with women's health care were on the ballots in several states. MSNBC's Susie Kim is in Atlanta with a report on that. Susie?
In terms of women's issues in this midterm election, there are a couple of different ways to look at this. And perhaps one way to look at it would be on the state level. In states like Colorado that sent a Republican to Senate, Cory Gardner, they also rejected a personhood amendment that would impose serious new restrictions on abortion. Also, in terms of minimum wage hikes, it's been pointed out by analysts that actually a raise in the minimum wage would generally improve women's lives more than men, given the fact that women tend to work working these jobs more. That did prevail in Arkansas and in Nebraska. Both are red states that did send Republicans, elect them into office. But this is perhaps one sign that in terms of pocketbook issues, in terms of issues that you might talk around the kitchen table about, that women's interests were sort of looked at, and sort of that there has been some economic progress made along those lines.
All right, thanks for that report. And for more on all of this, I'm joined here by journalist and MSNBC contributor Alexandra Pelosi. Joan Walsh of Salon is back with us, and Carrie Sheffield of Forbes. And in Washington, I want to bring in Alexis Levinson as well, and Corinne Jean-Pierce. We have you both up on the screen. We'll get to you momentarily, but let me start with you, Alexandra, and the war on women.
Yeah, what's going to happen with the Supreme Court? That's what I'd like to know. But you know what's interesting for being, I was on the campaign trail the last month, and what's one of the curses of being a Democrat, I guess, is that the people don't vote to say thank you. There's no thank you vote. You know, the people that the Democrats are out there advocating for and doing, carrying the water for aren't showing up to say thank you, or aren't showing up to show their support.
Well, I would go one further, and Alexis, you've been out on the trail covering a lot of these Senate races and keeping a close eye on them. It seems like a lot of folks said no thank you to the Democrats' attempts to make war on women a mobilizing issue.
Yeah, I think you see that specifically in Colorado, where that was really the bulk of Mark Udall's argument against Cory Gardner. He attacked him on being a sponsor of a personhood bill. And Gardner walked away from that. And you saw, as Susie said, you saw Colorado voters, they rejected the personhood amendment or the ballot initiative, but they overwhelmingly voted Cory Gardner into the Senate.
Yeah, and Corinne, you know from working for President Obama, it's not just persuasion, it's also turnout. Women did break Democratic in Colorado, but the electorate was more male than the national average. What do you make of that and the Democrats' turnout problem on gender in Colorado?
Well, here's the thing. We came into this midterm, the Democrats came into this midterm knowing that it was going to be an uphill battle, right? This is the second midterm of the president. We understand, like, historically, this is a very difficult time for a president for his party, right, to do well. We're going to lose seats. We did lose seats. We lost the Senate, clearly. We lost more seats in the House. So this was just historically nothing new here. We knew that was going to happen. I do believe that in 2012, right, the war on women narrative worked really well. The Republicans clearly.
I want to move back just to Carrie here because we've limited time. I want to bring Carrie in as well. Talking about 2012, but I want to stay on 2014 here, Carrie. And what do you think about Mia Love winning? Is that something that matters for the Republican Party? We haven't heard a lot about it, and yet it would seem significant.
Well, there has been a lot of coverage of her, and I'm from Utah, so I'm very excited to see that she's won. But, I think the war on women, it was a flop. It is not real. Yeah. It's fiction. And the reality is there are some isolated, awkward individuals who said awkward things on the right and on the left. And Joni Ernst in Iowa, who gave the Senate to the Republicans, was a victim of sexist attacks from the left. So we wouldn't see Elise Stefanik, the youngest woman in Congress, a Republican, elected tonight. So some word of advice to 2016, drop the war on women. It's not real.
Well, I will take issue with that, though. I mean, one thing that we should point out is that single women broke for Democrats 67-31 in this election, and they made up 21% of the electorate, only down 2 points from 2012. That's a big deal. So I think some of these issues carried. Now, Cory Gardner, God bless him, did a great job flip-flopping on personhood, coming out for over-the-counter contraceptives, even though it sounded like he didn't know how they work, because it's important that you get them round the clock. And Scott Walker cuts an ad saying that he imposed abortion clinic restrictions because he's pro-choice and he's trying to protect women.
Let me get your response to what I want to drill specifically. What Joan is saying is they may have won the election, but they only did it under so much pressure on these issues that you had a Republican back down.
I don't think so. I mean, I think Wendy Davis lost among women. It's clear that when you make abortion your signature narrow issue, that is a wedge issue, and it is a losing issue. To the point on Scott Walker, Debbie Wasserman Schultz was blatantly sexist in her approach to Scott Walker, and that backfired. So
that has nothing to do
there
with
is
his
no
flip-flop on
sinister,
abortion and his
there is
lies on
no
abortion.
sinister movement to attack women. I would not be part of the conservative movement if that were the case.
Let me go to Alexis on these Senate races. What about this idea, though? We're hearing the charge that some of this was downright sexist from the Democratic side, or maybe exploitive, and yet you can't deny the fact that in Colorado, the guy was back on his heels here.
He was back on his heels, and Cory Gardner, he did back away from this personhood amendment. And I mean, you saw a lot of Republicans actually in Senate races across the country kind of picked up that idea of over-the-counter birth control. You heard it in North Carolina with Tom Tillis, who also won tonight. Republicans, and they said it at the beginning of the cycle, they made a really serious effort to move away from the Todd Akins and the Richard Murdochs of the party. This was not what they were going to be this cycle, and I think they did so successfully. I mean, that's what the results, I think, suggest. They didn't open themselves up to those attacks.
Right, and the best spin that the Democrats will offer on that as well, they were so effective at making these issues important, they move people's rhetoric, but that won't move them necessarily in Congress, and that's why this is concerning to a lot of folks. Great panel. We kept a lot of people in it, but that cuts down our time. Next up, we're going to talk about ISIS and Ebola. They've been in the news a lot. They were heavy on the minds of millions of voters. We're going to break down what Americans want Congress to do to make them feel safer during these troubled times. Welcome back to MSNBC's continuing live coverage of Election Night, Decision 2014. I am Ari Melber. 1 a.m. on the West Coast, 4 a.m. here for those waking up on the East Coast. And we've got a Republican wave here taking the midterms, and we are breaking down the numbers this hour live. We're going to dig deeper into what all that control means and the issues that drove voters to the polls, plus a quick look eventually at 2016. But first, the big news, the headlines, the GOP's big night.
Tonight, Kentuckians said we can do better as a nation. Tonight, they said we can have real change in Washington, real change. And that's just what I intend to deliver.
NBC News can project that the Republican Party has maintained control of the House of Representatives.
The Republican Party, as is currently constituted in this year, pretty much sent the Tea Party back to the locker room.
We can and we will send him legislation. Under Mitch McConnell's leadership, we will send the president bill after bill until he wearies of it.
The projected winner in the Iowa Senate race is Joni Ernst. This is an Iowa gain for the Republican Party, but this also means that Republicans gain control of the United States Senate.
Thanks to all of you, we are heading to Washington. And we are going to make them squeal.
Make them squeal. That is a line that will not soon be forgotten in these midterms. President Obama facing a whole new political reality as the sun rises on Capitol Hill this morning. For the first time in 8 years, Republicans now control the Senate. They picked up at least 7 seats, and we're still counting with Alaska coming in late numbers here in the early morning. The Republicans expanding their advantage in the House to 250 seats. The Democrats have just 185. That is as lopsided as it sounds. You have to go back decades to find a margin like that. Now we got your numbers. Some of the key races, breaking it down in the heated contest there in the Senate. The polls closed in Alaska just 3 hours ago. Still, as of right now, NBC News saying it is too early to call that contest. Republican Dan Sullivan has opened up a lead over the Democratic incumbent there, Mark Begich. In Colorado, that's a state President Obama won twice. Republican Congressman Cory Gardner defeating the incumbent Democrat Mark Udall. Kentucky, Republican Mitch McConnell poised to achieve his goal of potentially becoming the next Senate Majority Leader. He easily dispatched Kentucky's Secretary of State, Allison Lundergan Grimes. And then you got North Carolina, the Republican State House Speaker, Tom Tillis, defeating another Democratic incumbent Senator Kay Hagan. We're going to have to wait another month, though, to find out what's going to go down in Louisiana. There, Mary Landrieu and her Republican challenger, Bill Cassidy, will now, we can say this officially, they're going to face off on December 6th. That's after neither candidate reached the 50% threshold that's required under state law. There's a third candidate there that cut into some of their support. Over in Arkansas, another Democratic incumbent, Mark Pryor, well, he lost his job last night, losing to Republican Congressman Tom Cotton. Then you got Iowa, obviously an important political state, and there, as you just heard it from those famous lines from Joni Ernst, making them squeal, well, she did what she needed to do and dispatched Bruce Braley from the congressman there, and she is the first woman, we should mention, now to represent Iowa as Senator-elect. She's the first woman there, and that, of course, was a seat being vacated by someone many Democrats remember fondly, Tom Harkin, who is retiring. Now, in Georgia, Republican businessman David Perdue also edging ahead, avoiding a runoff with Michelle Nunn there, the daughter of former Senator Sam Nunn. Up in New Hampshire, a bright spot for Dems, Jean Shaheen narrowly defeating Scott Brown, of course, who was once a senator from a different state, Massachusetts. Now, Kansas incumbent Senator Pat Roberts has been fighting back against that strong challenge from independent Greg Orman and Republican Governor Sam Brownback, who wasn't supposed to be in this close a race, ran into trouble with a lot of his tax policies, and ultimately, though, has basically pulled that one out. We've got MSNBC's Amanda Sakuma in Overland Park, Kansas. What can you tell us?
Embattled Republican incumbents on Tuesday overcame a crucial test for incumbents who were facing a nationwide wave of voter discontent over the existing leadership. Senator Pat Roberts, who had served in Congress since 1981, was able to fend off a late-surging third-party candidate, Greg Orman. Orman, in his concession speech here, said that he hoped that his candidacy would inspire fellow independents across the country to take on Washington just as he had. Meanwhile, Governor Sam Brownback was also able to eke out a win today. He has been under fire by both Democrats and Republicans alike for his very far-right economic agenda. His tax cuts and his spending cuts have launched Kansas into a shortfall for its revenue, and its bond rating was downgraded not just once but twice. Yet still, Brownback was able to overcome that with voters and was able to reclaim his seat.
Thanks for that report, Amanda. I also want to go to Florida now. This was one of the costliest governor's races in state history. Incumbent Republican Governor Rick Scott was able to fend off former Governor Charlie Crist, and that campaign was pretty bitter on both sides. But earlier tonight, both candidates hit an upbeat tone.
Florida is on a mission. And that mission is to keep growing and to become the very best place in the world to get a job, to raise a family, and live the American dream.
For me, it's never really been about right versus left. It's really been about right versus wrong. And I hope as Floridians, as we go forward, we can focus on that and work together and do what's right.
MSNBC's Aaliyah Furman has this report.
Incumbent Republican Governor Rick Scott of Florida managed to hang on to his seat against Charlie Crist of Florida here in this presidential battleground state. According to NBC News, Scott accrued 48.3% of the vote compared to Crist's 47%. It has been a long, expensive battle with TV ads topping over $100 million. Republicans have done their best to paint Crist as the ultimate flip-flopper, having been a Republican governor, then a failed independent Senate candidate, and now running as a Democrat. Crist, in his concession speech right behind me here in St. Pete's, said that it's not about right versus left, but it's about right versus wrong, and he wished Scott his best and said that the two had found common ground on Medicaid.
And here with me to break it all down, Beth Fooey, senior editor for MSNBC.com. Carrie Sheffield from Forbes is back. MSNBC contributor Alexandra Pelosi at the table. And joining us now, MSNBC political analyst Jonathan Alter. Let me just start with you, Jonathan. You've watched a lot of these races, presidential and off year. You saw those clips. What are your takeaways here in this night?
Well, you know, look, this was about as good as it gets
for the Republican Party. There's no way to gild the lily on it. But it is important to remember that except for in Colorado and Iowa, these were Mitt Romney states where the seats went to the Republicans. So it doesn't tell us a huge amount about 2016. I do think it tells us a lot about what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And the key soundbite is from Rand Paul earlier this evening, where he says Mitch McConnell is going to send the president bill after bill after bill until he wearies of vetoing these bills. So the Republicans will have the upper hand on legislation for the next couple of years.
Yeah, Alexandra, what's your view on that? Because this is a Republican firewall, and if they get their act together, they certainly can have a message machine of sending bills, however unlikely to be signed, over to Pennsylvania Avenue.
Well, it's going to be interesting for you, isn't it? It's going to be good to watch. It's going to be good fireworks. But seeing my friend Jonathan over there reminds me of when we were on the Bush bus together in 2000. And George Bush always used to say, you need to know who you are and you need to know who your friends are. And watching these stories coming from, the few examples you had there, Chris, perhaps he didn't know who he was or knew who he was friends with. Going Republican, now I'm an independent, now I'm a Democrat. Or, using Mitch McConnell as the example. Own it. If you voted for the president, own it. People want you to own it. And I think people do respect people who own who they are and who their friends are. So, it'll be interesting to see if the Republicans are going to be Republicans and the president's going to be the president. Well, maybe just it'll be, I don't know what to expect. I can't project, but what we...
Right. Well, no, and people on the East Coast here are waking up to these numbers. Beth, what I think Alexandra's putting forward is a simple theory, which is the kindergarten theory of politics: just be yourself. Go to school and be yourself. That's what you tell your kids, right? Don't try to be someone else. Don't try to impress everyone. Democrats weren't necessarily themselves when it came to the fact that they had a position on health care. We talked earlier about minimum wage, a bunch of other issues that they didn't affirmatively necessarily run on.
No, what Republicans ran on was just pure hatred of President Obama, pure and simple. They cast their Democratic opponents as basically being acolytes, being clones of the president. It worked. They got rid of a lot of Democrats. They're coming in with a lot of power now in Washington. Some of them are saying, yes, now this is our chance to work together, and we're going to get rid of the gridlock, and we're going to move forward, and we're going to pass some things that are important to the American people. I honestly, Ari, I don't see how that's going to happen. If they ran and won by saying that they were going to stop everything that this president was going to try to do, how do they then compromise with him?
And cut a deal?
And you've got the Rand Pauls of the world. You've got Ted Cruz, who want nothing to do with that compromising with President Obama.
Well, I take issue, and I don't think that it was just anti-Obama. I think there was a lot of proactive, strong messaging, and this was certainly a mandate for Republicans. So whether it was foreign policy, where President Obama has shown considerable weakness, whether it is fiscal reform, whether it is Obamacare, making reforms to Obamacare. I think we are at a juncture with Ted Cruz. I mean, he can show whether he will be a statesman or whether he will be, as I also write for a website called Opportunity Lives, and John Hart wrote an essay there talking about how Ted Cruz could be the Kanye West of conservatism, trying to make a brand for himself instead of trying to actually dive into the policy and fix Obamacare, rather than trying to do some crusade which will get vetoed.
Well, you talked to a lot of Senate staff, Jonathan, and Kanye West is one of the nicer words that would be thrown around about Ted Cruz. They're very frustrated with him, but also speak to us about Kerry's point here. I mean, I spoke to Reince Priebus here yesterday, yesterday on Election Day, and he said, yeah, we've got messages. We're going to do a budget. We're going to do Keystone. We're going to send it to the president's desk. He was fired up.
Well, look, they still need 60 votes. Remember how much of a problem that was for President Obama. So they're going to have to peel off some Democrats to get to 60, except on those areas that they can use what's called budget reconciliation to get a few bills through. So what they have to decide is whether they want to attach these, say, bills to cripple the EPA regulation on coal plants, if they want to attach that to the bills that keep the government open and then face another possible government shutdown. That didn't go well for them in 2011. They might now be so cocky that they want to do this again, go to the brink again. We'll see how that plays out. One contextual point, Ari, there have only been 2 elections since 1822, 1822, where in the 6th year of a 2-term president, the party in the White House did well.
Right.
1822 and 1998, when there was a backlash against the impeachment of President Clinton. So, you know, the idea that Obama had any kind of a chance to do well last night, I think was folly, but it did turn out to be worse than even a lot of Democrats expected.
No, you make a good point, and we so often lose the historical context. Ronald Reagan lost 8 Senate seats in the 6-year itch. People don't think of him as a political failure to his party or even his second term. Jonathan stays with us. Alexandra Pelosi and Carrie Sheffield, thank you both for your time and joining us here late night, early morning, depending on how you're counting it. The other big thing we want to look at next is the voter anxiety about ISIS, Ebola. Did that even matter politically? We're going to look at what people want Congress to do to make them feel safer and to turn the country around.
And we have indeed reached that historic day. We have realized the success of that movement. The people of Colorado, voters around this state had their voices heard. They are not red, they are not blue, but they are crystal clear. Crystal clear in their message to Washington, D.C. Get your job done and get the heck out of the way.
In Colorado there, Republican Cory Gardner celebrating his unseating of Democratic incumbent Senator Mark Udall. We're also keeping an eye on some big House races, one closely watched one. Massachusetts 6, Democrat Seth Moulton, an Iraq war veteran and political newcomer, beating openly gay Republican Richard Tassay. Moulton had already stunned Massachusetts politics by beating 9-term incumbent John Tierney. That was in a primary. Now, in the past few months, we all know the U.S. has been grappling with some big security issues, the terror threat posed by ISIS, the health threat posed by Ebola, to name a few. Well, we're going to have a close look here at whether any of that anxiety over our security was an actual factor in the midterms last night. MSNBC's Craig Melvin has more.
How anxious is America, Ari Melber? That's essentially the question, or a variation of the question that we asked. 2 stories dominated the headlines in recent weeks, as you mentioned, Ebola and the fight against ISIS. With Ebola, we asked voters to rate the federal government's response to the virus in this country. And as you can see, pretty divided for the most part. 44% say they approve. 50% said that they disapprove. But check this out. This is a breakdown by party. About 2/3 of Democrats say that they approve of the government's response. Only just a quarter of the GOP said that they approve. Turning now to military action against ISIS. There's more support for that from voters nationwide. 58% of voters say they approve. Some 35% say they disapprove. Again, here's the breakdown. 61% of those Democrats, 61%, still a majority. 56% of Republicans approve of the military strike. As for concerns about another terrorist attack in the United States, and this is something that we found very interesting, check this out. 72% of voters said that they are worried about another terrorist attack. In fact, voters are more concerned now than they were just after 9/11, just after we asked that same question back in 2004.
Right, which is ridiculous.
As you can see, 22% then said they were very worried. Now, 29%. 29%.
Yeah, and here's the difference. I mean, you just put your finger on it, Craig. That's a number that's worth pausing on. After 9/11, a terrible mass murder on our soil, the feeling then, the feeling of fear, you're telling me, does not match, but is beaten by the feeling today.
And that's just very worried. I mean, you take a look at that number. I mean, that's somewhat worried back in 2004. 43% are either, so I mean, what are we looking at? Roughly more than 70% of the country, according to our exit polling data.
According to the country's voters, yes.
72% are either somewhat worried or very worried. That's a staggering number.
I mean, Jonathan Alter, you covered that period. Now, we're talking about exit polls of this midterm election. They're not talking about everybody. And yet politically it matters. And I wonder if it goes to something that's helped Republicans, whether it's on purpose or not, which is the feeling that ISIS, because of their brutality, is so scary that they're going to come get us, when right now, if you look at the CIA analysis and all the information we have, they are not trying to project towards Western targets the way al-Qaeda was.
But the people think they are. So this is fascinating to me because 2004 was the only presidential election out of the last 6 where the Republicans won the popular vote. Republicans have lost the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections. That's a long time. The reason that George W. Bush was so handily reelected, and actually if it hadn't been for Ohio, he might not have gotten reelected, but he won that year after losing the popular vote in 2000 because of immense fear. It was the first post 9/11 presidential election. So the fact that we are back up to those fear levels, and you combine that with the fact that, as you mentioned, voters tend to trust Republicans more when they're scared on national security issues. This goes back generations. Those two factors might have given Republicans a little oomph last night.
Right, and it goes also to the messaging, because you're talking about that against the president who actually took out bin Laden. Basil, I want to play sound for you to get your response from David Perdue here, because he was in a race where he very clearly wanted to make the argument about some of these issues on security and competence, running against someone who wanted to make it about jobs. Georgia had the highest unemployment rate, we should note, in the country, and he got the better side of this, according to the voters that turned out. Take a listen here from last night.
Georgians want a safer America. They want a stronger America. They want a more secure America. Whether it's a stronger foreign policy, dealing with threats like ISIS and Ebola, fixing the VA, securing our border, and really doing something finally about this debt for our kids and grandkids.
It sort of sounds like the kitchen sink, but you can't be too tough on it when it worked.
That's exactly right. And I think, going to your point, voters may not have been motivated to go to the polls to vote on that issue, but what it does is feed into a larger narrative about the president and the administration, that despite the killing of Osama bin Laden, that he seemed a bit detached. And I think one of the big visuals that I took away, and I think was an interesting turning point, was when he played golf after the beheading. And that was reported in the paper over and over and over again. And I think people, even if they may not have been motivated to go to the polls to vote on that particular image, that image stuck with a lot of people. And you combine that with the VA scandal, and you combine it with, I think, a number of different moments where the president didn't control the narrative with respect to foreign policy.
And Josh, you pointed out that asking voters who'd you vote for is sort of like asking people, why'd you go on a second date?
Right.
You get an answer that tells you something about how someone wants to be perceived. It's not always the full answer. Right. We know, though, in separate data, that people have been following ISIS, and particularly those beheadings videos, very closely.
Right. Yeah, but I think there was room for this campaign to be driven by both fear and sort of this general sense that things have gone off the rails in Washington, because there was so little actual policy content to this campaign. It's a real contrast to 2010 and 2012. 2010 was a vote about whether the government was getting too big and too active in its response to the downturn in the economy. It was an election about Obamacare. 2012 was very much an election about Obamacare. Candidates couldn't make a really credible case about why electing a Democratic Congress or a Republican Congress, or really just the Senate, which is the only thing that was up, why that would affect the economy in a particular way, why something would happen in Congress that would affect your livelihood. So absent that, it was just this sort of emotive stuff about, I feel scared, things seem wrong, maybe we need somebody different in here. So I think, Michelle Nunn wanted to talk about jobs, but what was there to say about jobs? What was Michelle Nunn going to do about jobs in the Senate, going to be able to do in this dysfunctional Congress?
Jonathan, briefly.
Well, I was just going to say that I think the Democrats made a big mistake in not developing the jobs issue. They would have had to do it months ago. But, for instance, infrastructure, it should never be called infrastructure. But if they had made this an election about rebuilding America and said, we want to rebuild America, they voted repeatedly against more money for your roads, your bridges, your infrastructure. then it could have, teed that up, because infrastructure is popular. People know we need to invest in this country. So there was no texture to the jobs issue because the Democrats fumbled the framing of jobs.
There was no closing argument on jobs, and on ISIS, to Josh's point, you have to get up pretty early in the morning to figure out what either party really wanted to do about ISIS, because, to their shame, they left town without voting on the key questions. But ultimately, the Republicans may have been able to benefit from that more. Jonathan Alter, thanks for joining us here. Getting up pretty early in the morning is appropriate because it's 4:30 on the East Coast. Our live coverage is continuing with something really important we did want to get to that we didn't have time to earlier in our coverage, which is these elections were testing a lot of new voter ID laws in some states. What impact did they have? We're going to talk to a civil rights leader. That's next after the break. Back with our live coverage, 1:30 on the West Coast, 4:30 out east, and it is still too early to call Alaska's Senate race, according to NBC analysis. But you can see there, Republican Dan Sullivan having the edge over Democratic incumbent Mark Begich. It's about 49-45 with 73% in. And the contest for Alaska's governor's seat also still up for grabs as we deal with those numbers still coming in. Alexandra Gutierrez is the Capitol correspondent for Alaska Public Media, joining us live on the phone here. What do we know so far here as you see Sullivan definitely doing well?
Well, I am actually standing right outside his election party. He just took the stage, super high energy. Senator Begich, meanwhile, left his own party about half an hour ago and sent out an emailed statement saying that he's not going to say anything about the conclusion of the race until the rural votes have been counted. We still have a lot of native villages where returns are slow to come in, but given the margin that exists, it would be a very difficult gap to make up.
Yeah, I mean, we still have our tabulation here at Republicans having 52 Senate seats, according to NBC News tally and projections. What you're saying is you're outside Sullivan's headquarters in Alaska, and he thinks he's 53.
He absolutely thinks he's 53. There's no question about it. I mean, this feels like a party celebrating a win as opposed to biting nails. I mean, it's packed, it's overflowing, really, really high energy in there. Meanwhile, Begich's supporters, when they showed up at Election Central where votes were counted, were not just biting nails, but a little bit more resigned than they should have been. I think that they really thought that it would be closer.
Right. And Alexander, in the brief time we have, just in a sentence or two, is there anything the Begich folks have that says that this should really hold on at this point? Anything specific?
Well, the only thing that is kind of in question is the question ballots. We had 30,000 absentee ballots cast, or about 13,000 question ballots. So there's still a lot that's going to be counted over the next few days. However, with over 10,000 votes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in Alaska is a huge amount, it's going to be tough.
All right. Thank you very much for that reporting and joining us there. I want to move on to something we've been promising, an important issue. Those new voter ID laws, are they keeping some voters away from the polls? Voters in Texas, Mississippi, Kansas, and more than 30 other states were subject to some sort of voter ID law. I'm going to bring back Beth Fooey, senior editor at MSNBC, Basil Smikle, and joining us now, Barbara Arnwine from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Good morning, Barbara.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Thanks for joining us. We wanted to get to this. We do a lot of the results. Obviously, that's the big headline. But we've heard from some folks this is also a headline. One group here, your group, was saying that you got about 18,000 plus calls yesterday, and that's an increase. What can you tell us about the impact of these laws in voting yesterday?
Yes, we actually received as of 10:30 last night, over 22,000 calls, which is a 10,000 call increase from 2010. And it's clear that what drove the increase in calls was largely these voter ID laws, where there was so much confusion. In Texas, where you had this new strict ID law, we had, all kinds of problems with voters not knowing what to do, how to get the ID, and having problems of figuring out what was acceptable. We also saw in many states where there were no such voter ID laws, poll workers still insisting on voter ID. And that caused problems in Missouri, problems in North Carolina. Those were, problem states because of that. We also saw, a lot of polling places, especially in Harris County, Texas, that did not open on time. In fact, in Connecticut, it was so bad that a court order had to be issued to keep the polls open until 8:30.
Let me jump in, Barbara, and ask you, as people are following these races, do you see any specific races where you think these type of laws may have tipped the balance?
Well, I think they hurt the voters who tried to turn out in Florida, where they had, long lines and a lot of problems in a lot of the precincts. I think that we heard in Missouri that thousands of voters walked away because they couldn't vote. And we heard, problems and concerns in North Carolina. So, yes, and even a few problems out of Virginia in the Hampton Roads, Newport News area. So, yes, there were clearly a lot of voters who got turned away, who walked away, could not vote, or were denied the right to vote.
Stay with us. Let me go to Basil. The Democratic piece, though, here is that you have to organize around this. Has the party done that effectively?
I don't know if they've done that effectively because even in this day and age, it's not just about the restrictive laws, and that's extraordinarily important. It's also what we find is that in many districts where you have large percentages of people of color, you have what's been called sort of unbalanced election resources, meaning that you don't have enough machines, or the machines break too often. You don't have enough staffing, and the average African-American Latino voter waits 15 to 20 minutes longer than anyone else to vote. So it's both the law and the unbalancing of the resources.
And Barbara, when you look at this debate, the Texas law has been viewed as far more legally suspect because it doesn't even take certain types of state-issued ID, as we've covered, like college ID, while it does take gun licenses. Folks have said that might be so bad even the Supreme Court will reject it. Justice Ginsburg said it is likely a poll tax. Do you expect the Supreme Court to take that case that Eric Holder has pushed?
Yes. We do expect that that case will be decided by the Fifth Circuit. Remember that they never got to the merits of this case. All they did was decide that the case, that the injunction should not be upheld. So there will, of course, be a decision on the merits, and that will go all the way up to the Supreme Court without a doubt. I do want to point out that in 20% of the districts in polling places in Missouri, they ran out of ballots. So that goes to the point that was just being made that a lot of this is a problem of, election administration with African American and Latino districts being targeted for less resources and not treated with the same respect and the same provision of resources that are needed. So we are worried as the Election Protection Coalition about this impact on our democracy and this impact on voters of color and other vulnerable voters.
Right, and when we have these kind of election days and day after, we focus a lot on who voted. People want to know the headlines, but this is America. If anyone didn't vote for the wrong reason or for state interference, we got to care about that as well. I know your group does a lot of work on that, so thanks for joining us here at this early hour.
Well, obviously, thank you, and Georgia's got to get it right.
Yeah,
we are looking hard at Georgia. Litigation may be coming.
All right.
Because they really messed up by not processing those 40,000
We're right, and then the 40,000 is a big story, so we're going to be reporting on that as well. Thank you very much. I want to tell you what's up next. Midterm elections could give us, believe it or not, insights into the road to 2016. That race, according to some, might start today. What the exit polls say, that's next. Good morning. It's 4:45 a.m. on the East Coast. I'm Ari Melber with our live election coverage continuing. And the Republicans' wave of success in Congress was matched at the state level. So far, they have won 24 governorships, bringing them up to 31. And so far, Democrats picking up 8, giving them a total of 15. But several races still up in the air. The contest in Colorado, still, as of this morning, too close to call, with Democratic incumbent John Hickenlooper and Republican Bob Bubrez in a virtual dead heat. Another nail-biter in Connecticut. Democratic incumbent Dan Malloy trying to fend off a challenge from Tom Foley. Now, the midterm elections may have provided some insight into what we can expect, yes, in 2016. We're going to check in one more time here this morning with MSNBC's Craig Melvin with some numbers we haven't seen yet because we saved the future for later. Yes. Later has come now. What do you got on 2016?
I'm thoroughly confused, Ari Melber. 2016 presidential field just starting to take shape to a certain extent, but we can read some early tea leaves in this year's national exit poll. Take a look here. It's a midterm electorate in a Republican wave year, which may have helped an unnamed Republican candidate outpace Democrat Hillary Clinton. 40 to 34%. 40 to 34%. Another 24% actually did say that it depends on who gets the nomination.
Doesn't it, though?
Well, one would think that it should, perhaps. As we wait to see whether the former First Lady, U.S. Senator, Secretary of State, tries to add president to her resume, we also asked whether she would be good at that job. 42% said yes. 42% said yes, 52% said no. We asked the same question. We asked that same question about 4 potential Republican presidential hopefuls. And take a look at how that broke down. We asked that question to Republicans. 49%, nearly half of them said former Florida governor Jeb Bush would make a good president. 41% said Rick Perry, perhaps somewhat surprising to a lot of folks. 39% Rand Paul. 34%, the man that is probably going to get a great deal of credit for what we saw tonight, Chris Christie, New Jersey governor, head of the RGA, 34%. So again, just some early signs for 2016. Here's a look at the same question posed to independents nationwide. 38% say Hillary Clinton would make a good president. 32% Rand Paul. 25% say Jeb Bush, Ari Melber.
Yeah, and look, I can tell you from being around and on presidential campaigns, it's way too early to read much into, Craig, this part of the midterm electorate for a race. All this tells you, really, which is not nothing, all it tells you is, what are people's reputation at this early stage as national figures? I think asking whether they're a good president is really close to favorability. Do you like them? Do you think they deserve a promotion? And that's where Chris Christie does have a problem here. You look at his number, 64% saying he wouldn't make a good president. That includes 44% from the Republicans there. And that makes you wonder whether he's becoming the James Brown of the Republican Party, by which I mean talking loud and saying nothing.
Well, as you know, the head of the RGA, New Jersey's governor, his disapprovals have always been higher than most of the other presidential wannabes, perhaps.
Beth, let me stay with me.
James Brown reference at almost 5 a.m.
Well, hardest working man in the election business, Craig Melvin there, because he's all over the place. But Beth and Craig, stay with me. Beth, sure. Is it because Chris Christie yells at people so much, or is it something else?
I think that's part of his charm, but I think that's also part of the reason he will never be president. Look, we could put aside Bridgegate and whatever anybody thinks that he may or may not have known about the bridge closings. Look, we had a governor of a major state who told a constituent last week to sit down and shut up, a man who wanted to know what was going on with his Sandy recovery money. Now, that may be great television, and it may rile up a certain kind of, base voter who thinks it's really great for a governor to be aggressive, but that's really not very presidential, and I think he kind of jumped the shark at that point.
And not only is it not presidential, here's a guy who is not, he didn't just do it last week, he's done it a number of times. He sees the TV cameras, and he knows it's going to make news. He wears it like a badge of honor as well. Like, this is something that he takes great pleasure in. So you've got to wonder at some point over the next year or so whether he decides to act or appear presidential.
I think his act would wear down even the most hardened, tough Republican voters.
And Basil, Rand Paul also coming in with 60% of this electorate, this Republican-leaning electorate, saying 60% of them saying no, he wouldn't make a good president.
I don't think so, owing to everybody's point here. What he does works very well for New Jersey. and New York and perhaps this immediate area. But you take that mindset and that sort of brashness to Georgia and Kentucky, that's not going to work there.
Right.
And you're right. I think the Bridgegate is an issue. That investigation needs to stop first before he makes any trips outside of New Jersey that are going to be at all meaningful. And if you really don't see an end to that by the end of the year, I really think he's got to put it away because it'll hang over his neck.
And quickly, Craig, out of all these numbers you've been digging through tonight, whether it's on the board behind you or not, what really jumps out to you as telling?
Young voters, I think, and we didn't get to it tonight, but we'll spend some time over the course of today and over the next few weeks looking at the percentage of young voters we're talking voters between the ages of 18 and 25, folks who turned out in mass last presidential election, who really, of course, helped propel the president to another term in the White House. They not only did they not show up based on some of the numbers that we saw, they didn't show up in a big way. We're talking 20 to 25% fall off versus last midterm election. So that's going to be one of the many headlines. Young voters who were not enthused at all just didn't show up.
Right, and that age gap is big. That's a big thing, and it was a big thing for the Obama coalition when it worked. But boy, are Democrats hurting when it doesn't work for them, when these folks don't come out in the off years.
You look good, by the way, at 5 a.m. This suits you.
Really?
Yeah, you're holding up very well.
Thank you for saying
I've seen some
that.
of the other folks on air, like right now. they look like death warmed over.
You talking about us?
Well, no, I'm not. Not you. I mean, other hosts. Well done.
Craig Melvin, you saying I look good is like the Pope calling somebody holy. It's huge. It's huge. Now, we got one more block here in our live coverage. The voters have spoken. First time in 8 years, Republicans control the House and Senate. You see it there, what the voters have done. Where do we go from here? We have the final thoughts from our panel. We good night, Craig Melvin. We good morning, Morning Joe. It's all up next. Good morning. Republican Tom Tillis narrowly defeated Democratic incumbent Senator Kay Hagan in North Carolina, and his victory helped the Republicans win control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 8 years. GOP picking up at least 7 seats there. Republicans further solidifying their hold on the House, where they have 250 seats. The Democrats 105 seats. We've got some final thoughts here from a panel that's taken us all the way overnight. I want to start with Beth Fooey. What did we learn?
Well, I'm still very much of the opinion that Republicans don't know how to win national elections unless they're midterms, unless the voting turnout is older, whiter, more male, et cetera, et cetera. The classic Republican coalition. They've got a big problem with 2016, even though they won so well. Right. However, President Obama must have gotten a message from this election. It was a sweep.
And Basil?
I would say that the Clintons have this inimitable quality of connecting complex policy to the average voter, and it's something that is rare in politics, and in situations like this, I find it even rarer, especially when the party itself doesn't own its successes. And I think going forward, we've been leading with our head, and we need to start incorporating our heart into these elections going forward.
Putting your heart out there so people know where you stand. I think as we look over this, and I've been following this a long time and all overnight, the GOP, what we know this morning, they have a bulletproof majority in the House. We heard a lot about the Senate, but the House is something that's not going to be wiped away anytime soon. We know the anti-Obama message worked for the Republicans. We know Obamacare, however, turned out Democrats yesterday. That's a storyline that surprised some. We know minimum wage is popular even in states like Arkansas, where voters went for it 2-1, even as they kicked out a Democratic senator. And we know something else that Beth was just saying. The electorate that turned out yesterday is not, by any historical precedent, the kind of electorate that turns out next election. We've also listened to voters here and looked at the data. They've said they are mad at the president, mad at the Congress, mad at gridlock. We have a new majority of Republicans here, but if they don't listen and address that anger, they might face another anti-incumbent wave very soon. Some thoughts from us. Thank you for sticking with us overnight in our coverage. Thank you to all of our guests, Basil, Beth, everyone else who joined us over the night. I am Ari Melber, and up next, our coverage of the Republicans' big night continues with Way Too Early. Keep it locked here on MSNBC.